The grand masters of the two orders were spared and sent, together with the king, his brother Godfrey and the lord of Jebel, to Damascus, where they were thrown into prison. 382 On the following Tuesday, the Sultan resumed his march, and on the Thursday morning encamped before the walls of Acre. The inhabitants made no resistance, but came out of the city and met him with prayers for quarter. This he granted them, and, having given them the option either of remaining in the city or removing from it, and giving those who chose to withdraw time to enable them to do so, he took possession of it with his troops on the 9th of July. While here, Saladin received intelligence that his brother El-Melik el-Adil had left Egypt and was on the road to join him, having conquered the fortress of Mejdal-Yaba and the city of Jaffa by the way. Making Acre his headquarters, the Sultan dispersed his emirs over the country in different directions for the purpose of attacking the castles and fortified towns. Nazareth was taken after a slight resistance, men and women were carried into captivity, and their property plundered. Sephurieh was found to be entirely deserted, the inhabitants having decamped after the disastrous Battle of Hattin. Caesarea, Arsuf, Sebastia and Nablus were next added to the list of Saladin's conquests. The last named place fell an easy prey, as all the principal inhabitants, both of the town and its vicinity, were Mohammedan and consequently disaffected to the Christian rule. Fiole was one of the most important fortresses of the Crusaders, and a depot both for their stores and men. Against this the Sultan next directed his attention, and succeeded in reducing it after some days' siege. He did not, however, derive as much advantage from the conquest of this place as he had expected, for its defenders had found means of withdrawing with the greater part of their arms and provisions, so that the Sultan found no one there when he entered it, but a few of the lower class of the population. It was nevertheless important 383 in its results, for the conquest of the other principal forts of the neighborhood followed as a matter of course, and Dabirieh, Jabin, Toolieh, Lejan, Basin, and other places fell into the Saracens' hands, including the entire provinces of Tiberias and Acre. The Sultan then ordered his nephew, El-Melik el-Muzaffar, to march upon the fortress of Tibnin. After a week's siege, the inhabitants were obliged to sue for quarter. The request was referred to Saladin personally, who granted quarter to the defenders of the town, taking hostages for their good conduct, on condition of their entirely surrendering it within 5 days, and setting free all the Mohammedan captives who remained in their hands. This plan he adopted thenceforth with all places which he conquered, and thus set at liberty a large number of prisoners, many of whom were doubtless fighting men, and would add greatly to the numerical strength of his army. The occupation of Tibnin by Saladin's troops took place on the 26th of July, 1187, and 3 days afterwards the Muslim flag was flying from the walls of Sidon. Saladin next attacked Beirut, which place prepared for a long resistance, but his sappers and miners having succeeded in undermining the wall and weakening the foundations of the tower, the besieged deemed it better to capitulate, and the town was occupied by the Saracens on the 6th of August. While he was at Beirut, a letter came to the Sultan from one of his officers at Damascus, informing him that Odo, lord of Jebel, who, it will be remembered, was taken prisoner at Hattin, had consented to surrender his town on condition that he should be himself released from captivity. Saladin ordered him to be brought to Beirut in chains, and having concluded the bargain and obtained possession of Jebel, August 14th, he set Odo at liberty. The arrangement was not a politic one for the Mussulmans. 384 for Odo was an active and influential chief, and was destined to give them much trouble. The greater part of the inhabitants of Beirut, Sidon and Jebel were Mohammedans, which may account for the easy conquest of those places. The Christian part of the population, who had received permission to withdraw on the entry of the Sultan's troops, removed to Tyre, where the Count of Tripoli had retired after the defeat of the Christians at Tiberias. Hearing that Saladin was marching upon him, the Count vacated the city and fled to Tripoli, where he died. The Marquis of Montferrat, who had only arrived that year on the coast of Syria, happened at this time to put into the port of Acre, not knowing that it was in the possession of the Muslims. He was at first surprised that no demonstration of joy greeted his arrival, but quickly perceiving the real state of the case, he would willingly have sought safety in flight. The wind, however, being unfavorable, he asked for quarter and requested that he might be allowed to land. Permission was given him, but he pretended that he dare not trust himself ashore without a safe conduct in the Sultan's own handwriting, and gaining time by this and similar devices, he took advantage of a favorable wind springing up and sailed away to Tyre. Here he landed, and at once set about fortifying and entrenching the town, and being joined by the fugitives from all the towns conquered by the Mussulmans, he succeeded in establishing himself in an almost impregnable position. After the conquest of Beirut and Jebil, Saladin returned by way of Sidon and Sarfend, and passing by Tyre without attempting to assault it, he proceeded to the coast of Philistia, and having taken Ramleh, Yabneh, Bethlehem, and Hebron on his way thither, sat down before Ascalon and prepared to bring his engines of war to bear upon the walls. For 14 days the city held out, at the end of which time the inhabitants surrendered 385 on the urgent representations of the king and the Grand Master of the Templars, to whom Saladin had given a promise that he would release them from captivity so soon as he should have mastered the forts and towers which still remained in the hands of the Crusaders. Ascalon was enabled to make very good terms with its conqueror, all the residents being permitted to leave unmolested, and taking with them all their property and possessions. It surrendered on the 5th of September, 1187, having been in the hands of the Crusaders for nearly 35 years. At Ascalon, Saladin was joined by his son, El-Melik el-Aziz Othman, from Cairo, who brought with him a contingent of troops, and information of the departure of the Emir Lulu with the Egyptian fleet to intercept the arrival of reinforcements to the Crusaders by sea. And now came the supreme moment for the Christian power. The Sultan gave orders to march upon Jerusalem, and the greatest consternation prevailed within the Holy City. On the evening of Sunday, the 20th of October, the Mohammedan army arrived in front of the town on the west side, where it was met by a large sortie, and a fierce and sanguinary conflict took place. On the 25th, the Sultan moved his camp to the north side of the city, and began to set up his engines and battering rams, and shortly effected a slight breach. At the same time his sappers were undermining the wall which runs parallel to the Wadi Jehannam. The Christians, few in numbers and disheartened, made 1 or 2 sorties, but victory inclined to the Mussulmans. Balian of Ibelin now sallied forth with a flag of truce, and besought the Sultan to allow them to capitulate, but Saladin would hold no parley with him, and swore that he would capture the city by the sword, as the Franks had taken it from the true believers. The Frank leaders, finding entreaties of no avail, swore that 386, if terms were not granted them, they would sell their lives as dearly as might be, utterly destroy the city, and the Kubit-es Sacra with it, and murder every Mohammedan who remained in their power. As there were some thousands of Muslim prisoners in the city, this last threat induced the Sultan to reconsider his determination, and a council of war was called, at which it was resolved that the peaceable capitulation of the town should be received upon certain conditions. These were, that the Christians should pay 10 dinars for every man, 5 for a woman, and 2 for a child, and that those who could not pay were to surrender as prisoners. There were said to be more than 60,000 fighting men in the town, besides women and children and other non-combatants. The sum of money demanded was therefore immoderately large. Balian disbursed 30,000 dinars on behalf of the poor, and the Grand Masters of the Hospitallers and Templars, as well as the Patriarch, came forward nobly to the relief of their poorer brethren both with money and security. The Mohammedans entered the city on the 1st of November, just before noonday prayer, and at once took precautions for ensuring the due performance of the stipulation, by locking the gates of the city and allowing no one to leave without payment of the required sum, and moreover, appointing officers to collect the poll tax from the inhabitants. The Mohammedan historians themselves allow that great corruption prevailed amongst these officers, and that for a small consideration they connived at the escape of many Christians by the breaches which had been made during the siege, or even let them down themselves in buckets from the walls. Some of the more distinguished, especially of the women, experienced the Sultan's clemency. Amongst these was a princess of great wealth, who had resided in Jerusalem as a nun, and who was allowed to leave with her property intact. Sibyl, the queen consort of 387, the captive king, and the princess of Kerek, daughter of Philip and mother of Humphrey, were also excused the tax and permitted to depart. Zeha, one of the Saracen generals, sought and obtained the release of over 500 Armenians, alleging that they belonged to his country and were only present as pilgrims, and 1,000 more Armenians were set at liberty on a similar representation being made in their favour by Muzaffareddin Kakaberry, another of Saladin's officers. Committees were established in various parts of the town where payments were received, and a passport from any of these boards was sufficient to procure the bearer a free passage out of the city. As might be expected, much peculation went on amongst the inferior officers, in spite of which nearly 100,000 dinars were brought into the public treasury, while many Franks still remained prisoners in default of payment. The Franks were anxious to clear out of the place as soon as possible, and sold their lands and effects at ruinous prices to the Mussulmans, while the Patriarch stripped the Holy Sepulchre and other churches of the plate, gold and silver ornaments and other valuables, and prepared to carry them off with him. El-Imad, the Sultan's secretary, saw with displeasure the disappearance of all this treasure, worth, we are told, more than 200,000 dinars, and advised Saladin to forbid its removal, declaring that the privilege extended to private property alone. But the Sultan declared that the Christians should never have occasion to charge the Muslims with a breach of faith, and allowed the Franks to carry off all the portable articles they pleased. Those who were enabled to leave made the best of their way to Tyre, but there still remained over 15,000 defaulters, of whom 8,000 were women and children. When the Mussulmans were quietly settled in the possession of Jerusalem, the Christians asked and obtained permission to return, on payment of the usual tax. 388. A curious reason is given by the Arab historians for the strong feeling which the taking of Jerusalem excited throughout Europe. The Christians, say they, made an image of Christ and Mohammed, the latter holding an upraised stick and the former fleeing away, and carried it about with them in Christian countries to induce their coreligionists to revenge their quarrel by a new crusade. The first Friday after the taking of Jerusalem was a memorable one for Islam. Saladin himself was present at the public service and prayed in the Kubbat-e-Sakra, where a most eloquent sermon, Khatba, was delivered by the poet Muhyiddin, whose verse prophetic of the occasion has been already alluded to 74, and the concourse of people was so great that there was scarcely standing room in the open court of the Haram area. Page 77. The Franks had built an oratory and altar over the Sakra itself, and filled it with images and idols. These Saladin removed, and restored it to its original condition as a mosque. The Christians are also said to have cut off portions of the Sakra, and sold them in Sicily and Constantinople for their weight in gold. A great cross, plated with gold and studded with jewels, was found on the Holy Rock when Saladin entered the temple. This the Muslims pulled down and dragged with great glee round the city, to the intense horror of the Christians, who expected some dreadful visitation to follow such profanity. Saladin's first care was to uncover the mihrab or prayer niche, 75 in front of which the Templars had 389 built a wall, leaving an empty space between. 76 they had also built a spacious house and a chapel on the west of the Qibla. He pulled down the wall, covered the mihrab with marble, thoroughly cleansed the place, and supplied it with lamps, costly carpets and other furniture. The Sultan Nur-ed-Din had himself resolved upon the conquest of Jerusalem, but the expedition was prevented by his sudden death. He had ordered a magnificent pulpit mimbar to be executed by a celebrated artist at Aleppo, intending to present it to the mosque. This Saladin sent for and placed in the Jami, El-Aqsa, where it remains to the present day, and forms one of the principal objects of attraction to the visitor, being one of the most exquisite pieces of carved woodwork in the world. Both the Kubbat-e-Sakra and El-Aqsa were furnished by the Sultan with copies of the Koran, doubtless from the celebrated library at Damascus, the remains of which are preserved in the little dome, called Kubbat el-Qudub in the Jami, El-Amawiyyah of that city. The mihrab, that is, of the Jami, El-Aqsa, as being that of the congregational building, and therefore the principal one in the enclosure, it is necessary to bear in mind a few facts which are perfectly clear from the statements of the Arab historians in the original, but which are either neglected or misinterpreted by many European writers, and notably by Mr. Ferguson. These are, 1. That the Masjid el-Aqsa is the whole Haram area, including the Jami, El-Aqsa and Kubbat-e-Sakra, as well as all the smaller oratories, mosques, minarets and c2. That all these were built by Abd el-Melik, cp. 77, and that the Kubbat-e-Sakra is only mentioned more specially than the other buildings erected by that prince because of its magnificent proportions and the peculiar sanctity of the spot it covers. 3. That the Kubbat-e-Sakra is only a supplementary building, cp. 83. 4. That when the pulpit, the Qibla and c. of the Masjid el-Aqsa is spoken of, it must always be referred to that of the Jami, El-Aqsa, just as when speaking of the chancel of an English cathedral we should mean that of the main building, and not that of the Lady Chapel, and still less of any oratory, however large, that might exist in another part of the close. The account in the text is taken from Nur-ed-Din. The inscription recording Saladin's restorations may still be seen in letters of gold over the mihrab of the Jami, El-Aqsa. Some say it had been even turned into a latrina. The princes of Saladin's family personally assisted in the work of restoration and purification, and it is related that el-Melik el-Muzaffar himself headed the attendants, who swept out and washed the sanctuary. The process must have cost a considerable sum, for after thoroughly cleansing it with water they deluged every portion, even to the walls and pavement, with rose water. The mihrab, or as it is sometimes called, the Tower of David near the Jaffa Gate, was also refurnished as a mosque and endowed with funds. These more important buildings provided for, he turned his attention to the other churches and sacred places in the town. The church of Sion was occupied by Al-Melik el-Dil and his staff officers, the soldiery being encamped at the gate. The church of St. Hannah was turned into a college for the doctors of the Shafi'ite sect, and the patriarch's house adjoining, and partly built on the church of the Holy Sepulchre, was made use of as a cloister for the Sufi monks and philosophers. Both of these establishments were liberally endowed, and afterwards became celebrated schools of Mohammedan learning. As for the church of the Holy Sepulchre, it was locked up, and no Christian allowed to enter it. It had indeed a narrow escape, as many of Saladin's officers counselled him to destroy it. Thanks, however, to the Sultan's moderation and the noble example of Omar which he adduced, their advice was not carried out. The whole of the wealth which he had acquired by this conquest he distributed amongst the most deserving of his followers, disregarding the advice of some more prudent minds to keep it against future emergencies. He also collected all the Mohammedan captives and fed them, clothed them, and sent them to their homes at his own private expense. Saladin, having written to the Caliph to acquaint him with the victory, remained for some time at Jerusalem to complete the reduction of the fortresses in the neighborhood and to tranquilize the country, while his generals El-Melik el-Uftal and El-Melik el-Muzaffar proceeded 391 to Acre. The emir, Ali ibn Ahmed el-Mashtab, governor of Sidon and Beirut, remained behind with the Sultan. Hearing that the Marquis of Montferrat had taken advantage of the concentration of their attention upon Jerusalem to strengthen his position at Tyre, he began to tremble for the safety of his own towns, and continually urged Saladin to resume his campaign in Syria. Accordingly, on the 26th of October, Saladin once more set out for Acre, and reached that city on the 3rd of November. In 8 days more he had moved off to Tyre, and, encamping at some distance from the walls, awaited the arrival of the rest of his forces. On the 25th of November the reinforcements came up under the command of his son, El-Melik ed-Dahir Ghiyas ed-Din Ghazi, from Aleppo, and the siege was commenced in right earnest, all the wood in the neighborhood being cut down for the construction of the battering rams and other engines. But Conrad defended the place skillfully and gallantly, and it withstood all attempts to take it by storm. Hitherto we have seen Saladin prosecuting a career of victory, unsullied by a single defeat. The tide of war now began to turn for a time in favor of the Franks. The first disaster which the Muslims experienced was by sea. The Sultan had ordered all the ships of war to come up and assist in the blockade of Tyre, and those which were at Acre, 10 in number, quickly appeared upon the scene, and were joined in a few days by the fleet from Beirut and Jebel. The Marquis, seeing that this maneuver was likely to cause him some trouble, determined to counter it, and accordingly sent out his own vessels to give them battle. The Moslem ships were drawn up in line close upon the shore, and immediately protected by their own troops. The sailors, confident in the security of their position, neglected to remain upon the alert, and thus gave the Marquis his opportunity, of which he was not slow to avail himself. On the night of the 8th of December, 392 a number of the Sultan's ships were riding at anchor near the entrance to the harbour of Tyre. The sailors and marines were tranquilly sleeping in happy ignorance of the enemy's movements, when just before morning they were rudely awakened to find themselves surrounded, and at the mercy of the Christians, by whom they were at once boarded and captured. The Mohammedans were paralyzed at this sudden and unexpected reverse, and the remainder of the fleet were hastily ordered off to Beirut, towards which they made the best of their way, the army riding alongside of them upon the shore to cover their flight. Before, however, they had got far, the Frank vessels came suddenly down upon them, and the Mohammedan sailors, precipitating themselves into the water, made hastily for the shore, leaving their vessels without a soul on board. One schooner alone managed to elude her pursuers, and got off with all her crew. When the Christians came upon the deserted vessels, which they still believed to be full of men, they fancied that the Mohammedans were too terrified to give them battle, and poured tumultuously out upon the shore, and attacked the main body of Saladin's troops. The latter had by this time somewhat recovered their presence of mind, and gave them a warm reception. A desperate conflict took place, and the Franks were at last driven back towards the town. 2 of their leaders fell into the enemy's hands, and a great count was also taken prisoner. El-Melik ed-Dahir, who had not taken part in any of the previous engagements, at once ordered the last mentioned prisoner to be beheaded, and the Mohammedans, believing him to be the Marquis of Montferrat himself, whom he did resemble in form and features, were greatly delighted at the supposed death of so formidable an antagonist, but they had experienced a very heavy blow, and would fain have compelled the Sultan to relinquish the enterprise against Tyre and return home. Saladin, however, reproached 393 them with their faint-heartedness, and partly by bribes, partly by persuasion, induced them to persevere. As a slight compensation for his recent losses and defeats, he received news about this time of the capitulation of the fortress of Honin, which had been for some time besieged by one of his officers. The troops now began to suffer so severely from the winter cold and rains that Saladin was obliged, though with extreme reluctance, to raise the siege of Tyre. He had expended immense sums of money upon his engines of war, but these were for the most part too bulky to remove, while to leave them behind would be to strengthen the hands of the besieged. Some, therefore, which it was possible to take to pieces and pack up, were sent on to Sidon, while others, which could not be so provided for, were set fire to and destroyed. The army then broke up into several divisions, and departed with the understanding that they were to come back again in the early part of the spring and resume the siege. The Sultan himself moved on to Acre and camped outside the city, but the cold presently became so intense that he was compelled to seek shelter within the walls. Remaining here in winter quarters, he occupied himself in regulating and improving the public institutions of the town. With the first mild days of spring, Saladin was again on the move, and as the whole complement of the army had not yet come up, he determined to commence the new campaign by laying siege to the fortress of Kokub, but this proved a longer and more difficult task than he had anticipated. While the Sultan was at Kokub, he received a visit from the widow of Renaud, Prince of Kerek, who came to beg for the release of her son Humphrey. She was accompanied by the Queen and her daughter, who had also married Renaud's son. Saladin received them with great courtesy, and agreed with the Princess of Kerek for the release of her son on condition that the two fortresses of 394 Kerek and Shobek should surrender at discretion to his arms. Having exacted a promise from her to this effect, Humphrey was sent for from Damascus, and proceeded with his mother and a detachment of Mohammedan troops to arrange for the fulfillment of the terms of the contract. But the people of Kerek were by no means disposed to become a ransom for the young count, and met the widow's demand for them to lay down their arms with coarse jeers and opprobrious language. At Shobek, she fared no better, and was after all constrained to return to the Sultan with the humiliating confession that she had not sufficient authority over her troops to carry out the stipulations. Saladin, like a true and noble gentleman as he was, disdained to take a mean advantage of her failure, and allowed both the lady and her son to proceed to Tyre. In the meantime he sent troops to reduce Kerek and Shobek. Kokub still maintained an obstinate resistance, and Saladin, leaving an officer with 500 men behind him to continue the siege, and posting a regiment of 500 cavalry at Safed to harass the Christians in that quarter, left for Damascus, which he reached on the 5th of March, 1187. Here he received intelligence of the approach of his army from the east, and remaining only a week in his capital, he again set out for Baalbek, whence he marched on to Lebwe, and was there joined by Imad ed-Din, Lord of Sanjar, with his division. Disencumbering themselves of all the heavy baggage, the combined forces hurried on to the sea coast. Several months were consumed in military operations against the Franks without any decisive engagement taking place, though one after another, Jebele, Laodicea, Sion, Bikaz, and other towns and fortresses fell into the Sultan's hands, and materially increased his resources by the quantity of arms and provisions which they contained. The fort of Berzier gave him more trouble. This castle enjoyed the reputation of being the strongest in Palestine, and was situated 395 upon a lofty mountain nearly 1,700 feet high, with steep escarpments, and surrounded by deep valleys. Notwithstanding its formidable character, Saladin determined to attack it, and on the morning after his arrival, 21st August, he ascended the heights with his troops, both cavalry and infantry, and the whole of his siege train, and surrounded the fortress on every side. For 2 days and nights, a continuous assault was made upon the walls with the battering rams, and projectiles were thrown into the midst of the castle without intermission. On the morning of the 23rd, preparations were made for taking the place by storm. The whole army was divided into 3 parts, each of which was to carry on the assault for a portion of the day, so as to give the besieged no interval of rest. The 1st Division, under Imad ed-Din, commenced the attack with the early morning light, and the contest raged on both sides with unexampled fury. At last, Imad ed-Din's men beginning to flag, were relieved by the 2nd Division, commanded by the Sultan in person. Placing himself at the head of the storming party, Saladin called out to his soldiers to follow him to victory. Answering his appeal by a long and enthusiastic shout, they swarmed like one man up the rocks and battlements, carrying everything before them, and poured into the fortress. The defenders, driven back from the walls, now began to cry out for quarter, but it was too late. The blood of the Muslims was fairly aroused, and even Saladin's presence and authority could not for some time stop the indiscriminate slaughter. At last order was partially restored. The prisoners, an immense number, were secured, and the soldiers, loaded with booty, returned in triumph to their tents. Amongst the captives were the sister of the Prince of Antioch, to whom the castle belonged, her husband, daughter, and son-in-law. These were all treated by the conqueror with the greatest kindness and consideration, and were, together with a few of their immediate followers, 396 allowed to depart free and unmolested. The fall of Berzier was closely followed by that of Diersac and Bucras, both strongholds of the Templars near Antioch. The last of the two was a great depot of provisions, and by its capture a large quantity of grain fell into the Saracens' hands. Saladin next turned his attention to Antioch itself, but the prince of that town, knowing that it was not sufficiently well furnished either with provisions or arms to support a long siege, deemed it more prudent to come to terms. A truce was therefore concluded for 5 months, and an exchange of prisoners made. At Bucras the Sultan took leave of Imad ed-Din, Zanghai, and the Syrian contingent, who had done him good service in the late campaign. Both the chief and his soldiery received substantial marks of Saladin's gratitude, who bestowed upon them liberal presents, in addition to the share of prize money which had been already allotted to them. Saladin then proceeded with his own army by way of Aleppo, Hamath, and Baalbek to Damascus, whither his men were desirous of returning in time to keep the fast of Ramadan. Anxiety, however, for the success of the military operations which he had confided to his various generals, would not allow him to remain long in idleness, and in the beginning of October he set out for Safed. On the way he was joined by his brother El-Melek el-Dil, who had just concluded the siege of Kerek in Moab, that place having capitulated after a protracted resistance. Safed held out until the 30th of November, when it was ceded to Saladin's forces. The defenders obtained quarter by the release of a number of Muslim prisoners who were in their hands, and received permission to withdraw to Tyre. The Christians hoped to make up for the loss of this important stronghold by strengthening their position at Kokab, which was blockaded by one of Saladin's generals. They accordingly dispatched 200 picked 397 men to lie in wait for the Muslims at a certain difficult part of the road, and attack them at a disadvantage. But a company of Mohammedan troops happened to come across a straggler from this party, who, to save himself, betrayed his companions, and pointed out the ambuscade in the valley. The whole 200 were captured and brought to the Saracen leader. Amongst the prisoners were 2 chiefs of the Knights Hospitallers, and being carried before the Sultan, one of them said, "Thank God, we shall come to no harm, now that we have looked upon your Highness's face." This speech, says the Arab writer, must have been dictated by divine inspiration, for nothing else could have induced the Sultan to spare their lives. As it was, he set them both at liberty. The great addition to the besieging force, combined with the extreme cold and scarcity of provisions, proved too much for the endurance of the garrison of Kokab, and in the beginning of January, 1189, it was added to the list of the Sultan's conquests. After this, Saladin and his brother returned to Jerusalem, where the latter took leave of him and set out for Egypt with his division of the army. The Sultan then proceeded to Acre, and spent some time in fortifying and otherwise providing for the safety and good government of the town, which he handed over to the care of one Bahar ed-Din Karakash, who had in the meantime arrived from Egypt with a large following. Towards the end of March he commenced a tour of inspection throughout his Syrian dominions, visiting in turn Tiberias, Damascus, and other places. On the 21st of April, he reached the Shakif Arnan, near which he encamped in the plain called Merj Ayan. The fortress of the Shakif was in the hands of Renaud, lord of Sidon, who came in person to the Sultan, and begged for 3 months' grace to enable him to remove his family from 398 Tyre, alleging that, if the Marquis of Montferrat should get intelligence of what he had done, his family would be detained there as hostages. The Sultan acceded to his request and refrained from attacking his castle. Renaud, however, took advantage of this leniency to strengthen his own position and made secret but active preparations for war. Saladin, discovering the treachery, gave orders for blockading the fort, whereupon Renaud again endeavored to induce him to grant a year's cessation of hostilities. But the Sultan was not to be deceived a second time, and some officers he had sent to inspect the castle, reporting that the work of fortification was still being carried on, arrested the count, and sent him a prisoner to Banias. Sending for him a few days afterwards, he upbraided him with his perfidy and dispatched him for safe keeping to Damascus. As for the castle, the Sultan established a close blockade, although it was full 12 months before it was finally ceded to his lieutenant. While the Sultan was encamped in the Merj Ayan, the Frank forces were concentrating around Tyre, which the Marquis had contrived to make the greatest stronghold in Syria, and in which the last hope of the Christian arms was placed. On the 3rd of July they made an attempt upon Sidon, but were repulsed by Saladin, whose scouts brought him timely notice of the maneuver, though not without considerable loss on either side. After this Saladin retired to Tiberias, and occupied some time in making preparation for a decisive attack upon the Christian camp. Meanwhile, the Christians were by no means idle, but dispersed themselves over the country in various directions, committing much depredation and harassing the Mohammedan troops, who were continually falling into their ambuscades. On the 22nd of August, Saladin received news that the Franks had collected their forces by land and sea, and were 399 bearing down upon Acre, a detachment having already reached Alexandretta, where they had had a slight skirmish with the Muslims. The Sultan hastily issued orders for collecting the army together and hurried off to the relief of the town. Having arrived at Sephuria, he left his heavy baggage and pushed on to Acre with all speed, but the Franks were before him and had already invested the place, rendering the approach impossible for his troops. On the 13th of September, he made a desperate onslaught upon the besieging lines, drove the Franks to a hill called Tel Es-Seasie, and thus established a free communication with the city on the north side. On the 21st of September, the Franks assembled towards the close of the day and attacked the Muslims in full force. The latter, however, withstood the shock, and both sides fought with great fury, but night coming on compelled them to desist from hostilities. On the 24th, the Sultan moved to Tel Es-Seasie, which, from its commanding position, appeared to him a very important post to occupy. Here information was brought him that the Franks were dispersed over the country in foraging parties, and without loss of time, he dispatched companies of Arabs, whose familiarity with guerrilla warfare peculiarly adapted them for such service, to intercept them. The Bedouin horsemen bore down upon the small detached parties, cut them off from the camp, and slaughtering them almost without resistance, carried their heads in triumph to Saladin. On the 3rd of October, the Franks made a desperate onslaught upon Saladin's troops. A fierce battle ensued, in which victory inclined to the Christians, and the Muslims were compelled to flee, some to Tiberias and others to Damascus. While the victors were occupied in pillaging the Sultan's camp, a panic suddenly seized them. The Muslims rallied and attacked their left, completely defeating 400 them, and killing more than 5,000 cavalry, amongst whom was the Grand Master of the Templars. The bodies of the Franks lay in such numbers on the field of battle that the Muslims were much annoyed by the stench, and the soldiers were employed for some days in throwing the carcasses into the sea. Saladin now dismissed the Egyptian contingent, bidding them return in the spring, and both sides prepared for the winter, which was already setting in with great severity. The Franks fortified their camp and dug a fosse round the town of Acre, extending from sea to sea. The Sultan had in the meantime removed to his old camp at Karu Bay, where the heavy baggage lay. The news that the Emperor of Germany, Frederick Barbarossa, was en route for Syria stimulated both parties to further exertions, and the warlike preparations went on with greater activity than ever. On the 13th of December, the Egyptian fleet, which the Sultan had ordered to be prepared on the first landing of the Franks at Acre, arrived with a complement of more than 10,000 men. This reinforcement gave great confidence to the Muslim troops, and constant raids were made by the newcomers upon the Christian lines. The arrival of a Frank ship, laden with women about this time, seems to have demoralized both armies, for the ladies appear to have been somewhat indifferent as to religion and nationality, and to have bestowed their favors upon Christian and Muslim alike, according as one or the other happened to meet them on landing. The Arab writers, however, speak of many Christian women who were animated by the true crusading spirit, and it was no uncommon occurrence to find upon the field of battle, or amongst the prisoners, many champions of the softer sex. The new year AD 1190 came in and found things in statu quo, the town besieged by the Franks, and the latter in turn hemmed in by the Sultan's forces. 401 Saladin himself, ever actively engaged in inspecting his lines, was exposed to constant dangers. On one occasion, having ventured out hunting on the beach, he would inevitably have been taken prisoner by a party of the enemy, had not the advanced guard of his own army, which was stationed in the neighborhood, luckily come up in time to effect a rescue. Constant communications were kept up between the town and the Sultan's army by means of carrier pigeons and of divers, who managed to swim past the enemy's lines and carry letters and money to and fro between them. The Franks had constructed towers, battering rams, and other engines of war with great skill, and would have, no doubt, accomplished the taking of the city by storm, had it not been for a certain cunning artificer from Damascus, who succeeded in destroying them one by one with rockets, naphtha, and other combustibles, which he directed upon the works. The winter and spring passed away without any decisive change in the relative position of the two armies, but on the 13th of June, 1190, a second naval reinforcement arrived from Egypt, and the Sultan endeavored, by an attack by land, to divert the attention of the enemy and enable the marines to land. The Frank ships, however, were not idle, and several severe engagements took place by sea, in which the Muslims had decidedly the disadvantage. Presently news arrived that the Emperor of Germany had crossed over from Constantinople, and had been for more than a month, during the severest season of winter, in great straits, his army being compelled to devour their cavalry horses for want of food, and to burn their pontoons in the absence of firewood. On reaching Tarsus, the army halted to drink at the river which flows by the city, and the emperor, being driven, in the crowd and confusion, to a deep part of the stream, where there was a rapid current, was hurried away by the force of the stream, received a blow on the 402 head from an overhanging bough, and was taken out in an insensible and almost lifeless condition. A violent chill and fever was the result, which terminated after a few hours in his death. His son succeeded him in the command, and arrived at Acre with the remnant of a fine army in a miserable plight, and entirely dispirited by such a succession of reverses. The Franks, when they heard of the approach of the son of the Emperor of Germany, were afraid that he would appropriate all the credit of the campaign, and determined to make a final effort before he arrived. Accordingly, at noon on the 25th of July, they attacked the camp of El-Melik el-Dil. He withstood the charge, and managed to drive back the enemy without waiting for the rest of the troops to come up. At this juncture, the Sultan arrived upon the scene with a large number of men, and attacked the Franks in the rear. A complete victory for the Muslims was the result, more than 10,000 of the enemy falling, with a loss, it is said, of only 10 men on the other side. The arrival of Count Henry with a large following and much wealth gave fresh courage to the disheartened Christian forces. The Count distributed large sums amongst the soldiery, and the siege of Acre was prosecuted with more vigor than ever. Provisions now became very scarce and dear in the Christian camp, and many of the soldiers, compelled by actual starvation, came over as deserters to the Mohammedan lines. A few battles were fought, always with disadvantage to the Franks, many of whom were also killed or taken prisoners in the ambuscades which the Muslims were continually laying for them. On the 31st of December, 7 ships arrived from Egypt with provisions for the relief of the town, and while the inhabitants were engaged in assisting them to escape the enemy's fleet and get into port, the Christians took advantage of the walls being 403 partially deserted to make a desperate effort to take the place by storm. The scaling ladders, however, broke with the weight of the men. The storming parties were thrown into disorder, and the Muslims, on the alarm being given, left the ships to themselves, and rushing up to the walls drove back or cut to pieces their assailants. The incident was disastrous to both sides, for a sudden storm coming on carried the 7 ships out to sea, where they perished with all the crews and supplies. A few nights afterwards, a portion of the eastern wall of the city fell down, but the defenders thrust their bodies into the breach so promptly that the Franks were unable to take advantage of the opportunity. 2 curious stories are told of this period of the war. One is that a party of Frank renegades, having obtained possession of a small vessel, landed upon the island of Cyprus during the celebration of a feast. They immediately proceeded to the principal church of the place, entered it, and mixed with the congregation who were assembled there in prayer. Suddenly they started up, locked the door, and completely sacked the building, carrying away more than 27 prisoners, women and children, whom they sold at Laodica. The other story is that some Mohammedan looting the Christian camp had stolen an infant 3 months old from its mother's arms. The bereaved parent rushed over to the enemy's camp, and before she could be stopped by the guards and chamberlains, appeared before the Sultan's tents, lamenting her loss and beseeching him to restore her child. Saladin caused inquiries to be made, and finding that the infant had been purchased by one of his soldiers, ransomed it with his own hand and gave it back to its mother. A brig belonging to the Mohammedans and bound for Acre, with 700 men on board and a large quantity of arms and munitions of war, came into collision with one of King Richard's English vessels. The Mohammedan 404 captain, finding himself worsted in the fight, burnt his ship, which perished with all hands. This was the first serious disaster which the Mohammedans had experienced. In June 1190, hostilities were carried on with renewed vigor, and engagements were of daily occurrence. On one occasion, after a slight skirmish, the Franks retired with a single capture, and having got out of bowshot of the Moslem camp, they made a bonfire and roasted their prisoner alive. The Moslems, maddened at the insult and barbarity, brought out one of their Frank prisoners, and by way of reprisal burnt him in front of their lines. El-Imad, Saladin's secretary, who relates the incident, describes with much feeling the effect produced upon the minds of all the spectators by this exhibition of savage ferocity. The crisis was evidently approaching. The Franks endeavored to delude the Sultan into inactivity by proposals for peace, while they were at the same time hastening on their preparations for a final assault upon Acre. Saladin, however, was constantly informed of the state of things within the city, and knew that it could not hold out much longer. He, therefore, refused to listen to terms, but used all means in his power to force on a battle, and on the night of the 2nd of July he attacked the enemy's trenches, and succeeded in forcing a position at one, though not a very important point. At this juncture, Saif ed-Din al-Mashtub, momentarily expecting the city to be taken by storm, came out with a flag of truce to make an offer of capitulation and demand quarter on behalf of the inhabitants. King Richard received him with his usual bluntness and refused to grant the request. When al-Mashtub reminded him of the clemency which his master Saladin had exercised upon similar occasions, Richard answered curtly, "These kings whom thou seest around me are my servants, but as for you, ye are my slaves. I shall do with you as I please." 405. The Saracen emir returned to Acre highly indignant at this discourteous treatment, and swore that the fall of the city should cost the victors dear. When al-Mashtub made known the ill success of his errand, many of the chief men and emirs of Acre deserted the city, to the great chagrin of the Sultan, who condemned them to forfeiture of their estates and other pains and penalties. This severity, and the charge of cowardice, induced some to return and take part once more in the defence of the town. On the 4th of July a great battle took place, and lasted until the morning of the 5th, but without any decided advantage on either side. Evening again came and found them in the same position, the city surrounded by the enemy, and the enemy surrounded by Saladin's army. But on Saturday the 6th, the Prince of Sidon sallied forth from the trenches with about 40 knights, and rode into the Sultan's camp carrying a flag of truce. Saladin sent Najib ed-Din, one of his confidential officers, to arrange with him the terms on which the city should be capitulated. At first the Franks refused to listen to any other terms than the complete surrender of all the Christian possessions in Syria and Palestine, and the release of all the captives. It was then proposed that Acre should be ceded to the Christians, that its garrison and inhabitants should be allowed to leave unmolested, and that an exchange of prisoners should be made, one Christian being released by the Muslims for every one of their own men given up by the Christians. These terms were also refused, and Saladin's magnificent offer to throw the true cross into the bargain could not induce them to agree. Perhaps the relic had fallen into disfavor after its failure at Tiberias, or it might be that the Crusaders were beginning to rely more upon their own military prowess than upon the childish superstitions of the fetish-worshipping monks. On the 22nd of July, the Christians effected a breach in 406 the walls, and were with difficulty prevented from entering the city. El-Mashtub again sought Richard's camp with offers of capitulation, and this time with better success. It was agreed that the lives and property of the defenders of Acre should be spared on condition of their paying 200,000 dinars, releasing 500 captives, and giving up possession of the true cross. Suddenly, therefore, much to the Sultan's surprise and annoyance, the Christian standards were seen flying from the walls of Acre. He immediately dispatched Baha ed-Din Karakash to make the best arrangements possible, and promised to pay half the amount of the indemnity at once, and give hostages for the settlement of the remainder of the claim within a month. Hostilities were not suspended in the meantime, and the Franks, having made several sallies from their new position at Acre, suffered severely from the Arab horsemen, who continually came down unexpectedly on them and cut off their retreat. In the beginning of August, messengers came from the Christian camp to demand payment of the sum agreed upon. The first installment of 100,000 dinars was given up to them, but Saladin refused to pay the rest, or to hand over the captives until he had received some guarantee that the Christians would perform their part of the contract and allow the prisoners from Acre to go free. After numerous delays and disagreements, everything appeared at last likely to be satisfactorily arranged. The money was weighed out and placed before Saladin, the captives were ready to be delivered up, and the true cross was also displayed. Richard was encamped close by the Merge Iron, and had caused the Acre captives to be ranged behind him on the neighbouring hillside. Suddenly, at a signal from the king, the Christian soldiers turned upon the unhappy and helpless captives, and massacred them all in cold blood. Even at such a moment as this, Saladin did not forget his humane 407 disposition and his princely character. The proud Saladin disdained to sully his honour by making reprisals upon the unarmed prisoners at his side. He simply refused to give up the money or the cross, and sent the prisoners back to Damascus. Which was the Paynim and which the Christian then? In the first week of September the Franks determined to march upon Ascalon, and having provided for the safety of Acre, set off in that direction. El-Uftal, who was in command of the advance guard, intercepted them on their road, and managed to divide them into two parties. He then sent off an express to his father Saladin, requesting him to come to his assistance, but the officers of the Sultan represented to him that the army was not yet prepared to move. The opportunity was therefore lost, and the Franks were enabled to pass on to Caesarea. The Muslims, however, shortly afterwards started in pursuit, and on the 11th of September they came up with the enemy, and a bloody battle was fought by the Nahr el-Kasb near Caesarea. The next day both armies moved off to Arsuf. A battle took place on the road, and the Franks retired with considerable loss into the town, while the Muslims encamped on the banks of the river Auge. In a few days they again fought their way along the coast, and on the 19th of September the Christian army succeeded in reaching Jaffa, while the Sultan with his troops encamped at Ramleh on the afternoon of the same day. Here he waited for the heavy baggage, and when this arrived in charge of his brother El-Dil, he moved on to Ascalon. A council of war was immediately held, at which it was decided to destroy the fortifications of the last-named town, as the Franks were in possession of Jaffa, which lies about halfway between Ascalon and Jerusalem. It was clearly impossible to defend both towns without the maintenance of an overwhelming force in each, 408, and as Saladin felt sure that Ascalon, if besieged, would share the fate of Acre, he determined to raze it to the ground and concentrate his efforts upon the defense of Jerusalem. The work of demolition was at once commenced, and the city, one of the finest in Palestine, soon became a mass of ruins. The inhabitants suffered severely by this transaction, for they were obliged to sell their property at ruinous prices and dispersed themselves over the country to find a home where best they could. The intermediate fortresses of Lydda, Ramleh, and Natron were next destroyed, and on the 14th of October the Sultan camped on a high hill near the latter town. A few unimportant engagements had in the meantime taken place between the two armies, in one of which Richard narrowly escaped being taken prisoner. Negotiations were now reopened between El-Melik el-Dil and King Richard, and a peace was actually arranged, upon the stipulation that Richard should give his sister in marriage to El-Dil, and that the husband and wife should occupy the throne of Jerusalem, and jointly rule over the Holy Land. The Grand Masters of the Templars and Hospitallers were to occupy certain villages, but they were not to retain possession of any of their castles. The Queen was to have no military attendance in Jerusalem, although a certain number of priests and monks were still to be allowed there. El-Dil called the principal men of the army around him, El-Imad, Saladin's secretary, amongst the number, and deputed them to consult the Sultan's wishes upon the subject. The latter agreed to the conditions, and on the 30th of October the messengers returned to King Richard to inform him of the acceptance of his proposal. The Frank chiefs, however, strongly opposed the match, while the priests poisoned the princess's mind and induced her to withdraw from the engagement, except on the condition that El-Dil should embrace the Christian 409 religion. This, of course, he declined to do, and the negotiations fell through. The Sultan then moved off to Ramleh, so as to be nearer the enemy. Here news was brought him that the Franks had made a sortie at Barza. Hastening against them, he approached their camp and completely surrounded it, but the Christians charged fiercely and suddenly, and broke through the Mohammedan ranks. On the 18th another conference was held between El-Dil and the King of England, but again their attempts at negotiations failed. The Lord of Sidon, who had come from Tyre, was more fortunate, and concluded a peace with the Sultan, hoping by this means to strengthen his own hands against Richard. The latter on this again renewed his proposals, but they, as usual, came to nothing, for whenever an arrangement was on the point of being concluded, his bad faith or stupidity rendered it abortive. There was now no longer any doubt but that the Franks were bent upon the conquest of the Holy City, and as winter was coming on apace, the Sultan retired on the 14th of December within the walls of Jerusalem and occupied himself with the fortification of the town. He, however, provided for the safety of the country between Jerusalem and Jaffa by posting brigades of soldiers in the various passes and defiles upon the road. A party of workmen opportunely arrived at this time from Mosul, dispatched by the sovereign of that place, who also sent money to pay them. These were employed in digging the trenches and remained 6 months engaged upon the work. In addition to this, Saladin built a strong wall round the town, at which he compelled more than 2,000 Frank prisoners to labor. He repaired the towers and battlements between the Damascus and Jaffa gates, expending upon them an immense sum of money, and employing in their construction the large stones which were quarried out in cutting the trench. His sons, his 410 brother, El-Dil, and other princes of his court, acted as overseers of the work, whilst he himself daily rode about from station to station encouraging the labourers, and even bringing in building stones upon the pommel of his saddle. His example was followed by all classes of inhabitants, and the work of fortification went on with great rapidity. By the beginning of the year 1192, the wall was completed, the trenches were dug, and the inhabitants awaited with complacency the arrival of the besieging army. On the 20th of January the Franks left Ramleh, and had advanced as far as Ascalon, when they suddenly changed their intention of marching upon Jerusalem and stayed to rebuild the demolished city. El-Mashtub, who had been taken prisoner by the Franks, but had purchased his ransom for the sum of 50,000 dinars, of which he had actually paid 30,000, and given pledges for the rest, came to Jerusalem on the 18th of March. The Sultan received him graciously, and gave him the town of Nablus and its vicinity as a compensation for his heavy pecuniary loss. The general did not, however, live long to enjoy his good fortune, but died in the course of the year, bequeathing a third of his estate to the Sultan, and leaving the rest to his son. On the 29th of March, the Marquis of Montferrat was assassinated at Tyre by 2 men as he was leaving the house of the bishop, where he had just been entertained at a repast. The murderers were at once arrested and put to an ignominious death, not, however, until they had confessed that it was the King of England who had instigated them to the deed. Many attempts have been made by historians to clear King Richard's character from this foul blot, and a letter purporting to come from the Old Man of the Mountain, accepting the responsibility of the act, is triumphantly appealed to. The document in question is, however, a transparent forgery, and the unscrupulous character and savage brutality of the lion-hearted king afford 411 only too good reason for believing the dying testimony of the actual perpetrators of the crime. At any rate, Richard alone profited by it, and obtained possession of Tyre, which he subsequently made over to Count Henry of Champagne. On the death of the Marquis, Richard again endeavoured to come to terms with Saladin, proposing to divide the country equally between the latter and himself, and to leave all Jerusalem and its fortifications in possession of the Muslims, with the sole exception of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. A great reverse was experienced by the Mohammedans about this time by the fall of Dharam, a strong fortress situated on the border of the Egyptian territory beyond Gaza. The Franks stormed the town after having effected a breach in the walls, and refused quarter to the inhabitants. The governor, finding all hope of further resistance gone, escaped to Hebron. The superintendent of stores, however, remained, and determining that the besiegers should reap as little profit as possible from their conquest, hamstrung all the beasts of burden and burnt them. When the Christians entered the city, they put nearly every one of the inhabitants to the sword, reserving only a few prisoners, for whom they thought they might obtain a heavy ransom. Several other engagements took place in the same neighbourhood, in which the Franks were not so successful, and on the 3rd of April they divided their camp into 2 parties, the one making its headquarters at Ascalon, and the other pitching at Beit Jibrin. Jerusalem was now threatened with an immediate attack, but the vigilance of the Sultan warded off the blow, and a determined sortie compelled the enemy to retire to Colonia. The Sultan had sent frequent messengers to Egypt to hurry on the departure of the army, which was being levied in that country for the relief of Jerusalem. Failak ed-Din, El-Dil's brother who was in command, pitched his tents at Bilbi's, whence, as soon as his numbers 412 were complete, he set off, followed by an immense concourse of merchants and traders who had taken advantage of the military escort across the desert. On the 23rd of June news reached the Sultan that the Egyptian contingent was on the march, but that, relying on their numbers, they were proceeding without due caution, while the King of England with a large force was lying in wait for them upon the road. Saladin sent off an officer at the head of a division to meet the approaching force, with orders to conduct them round by the desert, and take them over the river of El Hesi before the enemy should come upon them. Failak ed-Din, however, did not take any means to inform himself concerning the place of rendezvous, but taking the shortest road, and sending his heavy baggage round by another way, he called a halt, and encamped for the night beside a stream called El Kawelaife. With the early dawn next morning the enemy came suddenly upon them, and a scene of indescribable confusion ensued. The Muslims started up from their sleep, ran frantically off in any direction that was open to them, and thus escaped in the twilight. Their baggage, arms, and equipments fell of course into the enemy's hands. This was so far fortunate, for if the Franks loved slaughter well they loved plunder better, and there was sufficient to turn their attention from pursuing the fugitives of the Egyptian force thus completely broken up and routed. Some wandered back to Egypt, not a few were lost in the desert, and a miserable remnant found their way by Kerek to Jerusalem, where the Sultan received them kindly and condoled with them upon their misfortune. The Crusaders, being unsuccessful against Jerusalem, determined to make an expedition against Beirut, as the occupation of that port was most important for their communications with home, and its conquest seemed likely to prove an easy matter. But they had miscalculated the tactics of the man with 413 whom they had to deal. Saladin, who appears throughout to have possessed the fullest information respecting their movements, sent orders to his son, El-Uftal at Damascus, to prepare for their reception. Accordingly, when they reached the sea coast of Syria they found Beirut occupied by the Damascene troops, and a large army awaiting them in the Merj Ayan, which prevented the Franks in Acre from coming to the assistance of their comrades. Taking advantage also of their absence, Saladin bore down upon Jaffa, which in the absence of King Richard could not hold out for long. The Muslims had already effected an entry into the city, and were about to take possession of the fortress, when Saladin, who could never refuse a petition for quarter, and whose experience of the Crusaders' good faith had not yet taught him prudence, allowed himself to be prevailed upon by promises of submission on the part of the Patriarch and other chief men of the town to grant a day's delay, and treat about the terms of capitulation. Of this concession the Christians, as usual, took a mean advantage, and while they deluded the Sultan with false oaths and promises, they were sending express messengers to hasten the return of Richard, who unexpectedly arrived by sea in the very midst of the negotiations and took possession of the citadel. The Muslims thus lost much of the advantage which their victory gave them, but they still retained possession of the town itself, and recovered the greater part of the property which had been plundered from the Egyptian contingent. Both parties were now at a deadlock. The Franks on their side could not hope to take Jerusalem, and the Muslims on theirs were unable to drive the Christians out of the country. Richard was the first to propose an armistice, but Saladin still held out, and strenuously urged upon his officers the necessity for continuing the jihad, or holy war. But the Mohammedan chiefs were weary of continued fighting without decisive results. 414, and as strongly urged upon the Sultan that the army required rest, and that peace was absolutely necessary to enable the country to recover its industrial activity, the repression of which had already caused so much misery to the inhabitants. An appeal to Saladin on behalf of a suffering community was never made in vain, and he consented to forego the attractions of military glory for the sake of his people's prosperity. A truce of 3 years and 8 months, both by land and sea, was ultimately agreed upon, commencing 2nd of September, 1192. The crusading princes and generals took solemn oaths to observe the conditions of the treaty, with the sole exception of King Richard, who held out his hand to the Saracen Sultan, and said that there was his hand upon it, but a king's word might be taken without an oath. Saladin returned his grasp, and professed himself satisfied with that mode of ratifying the truce. He probably felt that in this frank and cordial demonstration he had a better guarantee of Richard's good faith than any oath would have afforded, for bitter experience had taught him that so long as an unscrupulous priest remained to give the sanction of the Church to an act of perfidious meanness, a crusader's oath was of little value. The terms of the truce were that the seaboard from Jaffa to Caesarea and from Acre to Tyre should remain in the hands of the Franks, and that Ascalon should not be rebuilt. The Sultan, on his side, insisted that the territory of the Ismailites should be included in the truce, and the Franks on theirs demanded a similar privilege for Antioch and Tripoli. Lydda and Ramleh were to be considered common ground. Saladin, on the conclusion of the truce, occupied himself in strengthening the walls and fortifications of Jerusalem, and the Crusaders, having free access to the city, commenced visiting the Holy Sepulchre in crowds, and to judge from the accounts given of their behavior, this privilege, for which they had been fighting so long, 415 was after all but lightly esteemed. King Richard begged Saladin not to allow anyone to visit the city without a written passport from himself, hoping by this means to keep up the devotional longings of his followers, and so to induce them to return at the expiration of the truce. Saladin's keen penetration at once detected the impolicy of such a step, while his sense of honor revolted against its discourtesy. The request was, therefore, refused. Richard shortly after this fell ill, and leaving the government in the hands of his nephew Count Henry, he sailed away and left the Holy Land forever. Saladin, whose restless energy and religious zeal would not allow him to remain long in idleness, prepared for a pilgrimage to Mecca, and had actually written to Egypt and to Arabia to make the necessary arrangements. But at the instance of his officers, who represented to him the urgent need which the country stood in of his presence, he relinquished his intention. After a tour through Syria, in the course of which he provided for the safety and good government of the towns through which he passed, redressing the wrongs of the people, punishing those who exercised injustice or oppression, and rewarding all whose administration had been moderate and just, he returned to Damascus after an absence of 4 years, during the whole of which time he had been incessantly occupied in the prosecution of the Holy War. His arrival was hailed with the greatest demonstrations of joy. The city was illuminated, and for days the people made holiday to celebrate the return of their beloved sovereign, the saviour of el-Islam. But their joy was short-lived, for on the 21st of February 1193 he was seized with a bilious fever, and after lingering for 12 days he expired and was buried in the citadel of Damascus, in the apartments in which he died. A short time afterwards, the Sultan's remains were removed to the tomb which they now occupy, in the vicinity of the Great Mosque, and which had been prepared for their 416 reception by his son, El-Uftal. Saladin was nearly 57 years old when he died. His father Ayyub was the son of a certain Kurd, a native of Davin, named Shadi, and a retainer of Imad ed-Din Zanghai, father of the celebrated Sultan Nur ed-Din of Damascus. From him the dynasty was called the Kurdish or Ayyubite dynasty. At the outset of his career, Saladin delighted to emulate his great namesake, Yusuf-is-Sadiq, the Joseph of scripture story. In pursuance of this idea he sent for his father to Egypt immediately upon his accession to power, and offered to give up all authority into his hands. This Ayyub declined, and contented himself with the honourable and lucrative post of controller of the treasury, with which his son entrusted him. The old gentleman died of a fall from his horse, while his son was absent upon one of his expeditions against the Christians at Kerek. No better proof can be given of the respect and esteem which Saladin's many virtues naturally commanded than the terms upon which he lived with his brother and other relatives, in spite of the too frequent application of the proverb, which says that the Turk can bear no brother near the throne. We do not hear of a single instance of jealousy or insubordination being exhibited against his authority by any member of his house or court, while his subjects absolutely idolized him. Saladin knew how to win the affection of his troops while he made his authority felt, and his example restrained in them that license which war too often engenders. Courteous alike to friend and foe, faithful to his plighted word, noble in reverses and moderate in success, the Paynim Saladin stands forth in history as fair a model of a true knight sans pour et sans reproach as any which the annals of Christian chivalry can boast. Chapter 17. The Mohammedan Pilgrims. Proclaim unto the people a solemn pilgrimage, let them come unto thee on foot and on every lean camel arriving from every distant road, that they be witnesses of the advantages which accrue from visiting this holy place. Koran, Cap, Roman 22, VV, 28-29. There are 2 kinds of pilgrimage in Islam, the Hajj and the Ziyar. The first is the greater pilgrimage to the shrine of Mecca, and this it is absolutely incumbent upon every Muslim to perform once at least in his life, as the injunction is, however, judiciously qualified by the stipulation that the true believer shall have both the will and the power to comply with it. A great many avoid the tedious and difficult journey. The second, or Ziyar, consists in visiting the tombs of saints or other hallowed spots, and is an easier and more economical means of grace, as the pilgrim can choose his shrine for himself. Next to that of Mecca and Medina, the pilgrimage to Jerusalem is most esteemed by Mohammedan devotees, and as we have already seen, political exigencies have, on more occasions than one, caused it to be substituted for the more orthodox and genuine Hajj. While all Muslims are enjoined to visit Mecca, they are recommended to go to Jerusalem. Plenary indulgence and future rewards are promised to those who visit the holy city, and the effect of all prayers 418 and the reward or punishment of good or evil works are doubled therein. Such as are unable to accomplish the journey may send oil to furnish a lamp, and as long as it burns the angels in the place will pray for the sender. As for those who build, repair, or endow any portion of the mosque, they will enjoy prolonged life and increased wealth on earth, as well as a reward in heaven. The Roman Church is not singular in its successful dealings with rich and moribund sinners. The pilgrim in entering the haram puts his right foot forward and says, "O Lord, pardon my sins and open to me the doors of thy mercy." As he goes out, he repeats the customary benediction upon Mohammed and exclaims, "O Lord, pardon my sins and open to me the doors of thy grace." In entering the Kubbat-es-Sakra, he should be careful to keep the holy rock upon his right hand, so that in walking round it, he may exactly reverse the proceedings in the case of the Tawaf, or circuit of the Kaaba at Mecca. He should then enter the cave which is beneath the Sakra with humility of deportment, and should first utter the formula called the prayer of Saladin, viz., "O God, pardon the sinners who come here and relieve the injured." After this, he may pray for whatsoever he pleases, with the assurance that his request will be granted. As he is conducted about the Haram-es-Sharif, the various sacred spots are pointed out to him, and when he has performed the requisite number of prostrations, and repeated the appropriate prayer dictated by his guide, the story or tradition of each is solemnly related to him. Thus, on approaching the holy rock, he is told that it is one of the rocks of paradise, that it stands on a palm tree, beneath which flows one of the rivers of paradise. Beneath the shade of this tree Asia, the wife of Pharaoh, who is said to have been the most beautiful woman in the world, and Miriam, the sister of Moses, shall stand on 419 the day of resurrection, to give drink to the true believers. This Sakra is the center of the world, and on the day of resurrection the angel Israfil will stand upon it to blow the last trumpet. It is also 18 miles nearer heaven than any other place in the world, and beneath it is the source of every drop of sweet water that flows on the face of the earth. It is supposed to be suspended miraculously between heaven and earth. The effect upon the spectators was, however, so startling that it was found necessary to place a building round it and conceal the marvel. The Qadam-es-Sharif, or footstep of the Prophet, is on a detached piece of a marble column on the southwest side of the Sakra. It is reported to have been made by Mohammed in mounting the beast Borak, preparatory to his ascent into heaven on the night of the Emiraj. Before leaving the Kubbat-es-Sakra, the pilgrim is taken to pray upon a dark-colored marble pavement just inside the gate of the Kubbat-es-Sakra, called Bab el-Jannah. Some say that this is the spot upon which the prophet Elias prayed, others that it covers the tomb of King Solomon. All agree that it is a stone which originally formed part of the pavement of paradise. A descent into the Maghara or cave beneath the Sakra, a reverential salutation of the tongue of the rock, a broken column slanting against the roof of the cave, a prayer before the marks of the angel Gabriel's fingers, and if he be a Shia, a fervent prostration before a piece of iron bar which does duty as the sword of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Lion of God. These, with a few others of less interest, complete the objects of special devotion in the Kubbat-es-Sakra itself. On issuing forth into the open court, more wonders meet his eye. First, there is the beautiful Kubbat-es-Silsileh 77-420, or Dome of the Chain. It derives its name from a tradition that in King Solomon's time, a miraculous chain was suspended between heaven and earth over this particular spot. It was possessed of such peculiar virtue that whenever two litigants were unable to decide their quarrel, they had but to proceed together to this place, and endeavor each to seize the chain, which would advance to meet the grasp of him who was in the right, and would elude all efforts of the other to catch it. One day 2 Jews appealed to the ordeal. One accused the other of having appropriated some money which he had confided to his keeping, and swearing that he had not received it back, laid hold of the chain. The fraudulent debtor, who had artfully concealed the money in the interior of a hollow staff upon which he was leaning, handed it to the claimant, and swore that he had given back the money. He also was enabled to seize the chain, and the bystanders were hopelessly perplexed as to the real state of the case. From that moment the chain disappeared, feeling doubtless that it had no chance of supporting its character for legal acumen in the midst of a city full of Jews. Also called Malik Mitdad, or the Tribunal of David. The place, however, still retains some of its judicial functions, and if we are to credit Arab historians, perjury is an exceedingly dangerous weapon in the neighborhood of the Sakra. It is related that the Caliph Omar ibn Abdel Aziz ordered the stewards of his predecessor Suleiman to give an account of their stewardship upon oath before the Sacra. One man alone refused to swear and paid 1,000 dinars rather than do so. In a year's time he was the only survivor of them all. The Constantinople cabinet might take a hint from this. On the right hand of the Sacra, in the western part of the court, is a small dome called the Kubit el-Emeraj, or Dome of the Ascent, which marks the spot from which Mohammed is supposed to have started upon his heavenly journey. It is, of course, one of the principal objects of 421, the Muslim pilgrims' devotion. The present dome was erected in the year 597, on the site of an older one which had fallen into ruins, by a certain governor of Jerusalem named Ez-Zangeli. The Makam en-Nebi, or Prophet's Standpoint, is celebrated from its connection with the same event. It is now occupied by an elegant pulpit of white sculptured marble. At the end of the Haram area on the eastern side is a spot known as Suq el-Marifa, Market of Knowledge, behind the praying place of David. The tradition attaching to this spot is that when any of the ancient Jewish occupants of the city had committed any sin, he wrote up over the door of his own house a notice of the fact, and came to the Market of Knowledge to pray for forgiveness. If he obtained his request, he found the written confession obliterated from his door. But if the writing still remained, the poor Jew was rigorously cut off from all communication with his kind, until the miraculous signature of pardon was accorded him. A little lower down on the same side is a small apartment containing an ancient marble niche, resembling in shape the ordinary Mohammedan mihrab. This is usually known as Meht Isa or Jesus' cradle, although some of the Muslim doctors, with greater regard for the antiquarian unities, call it Mary's prayer niche. The pilgrim enters the place with reverence and repeats the Surat Maryam, a chapter of the Quran which gives the Mohammedan account of the birth and ministry of our Lord. By the Jami en-Nisa, or Woman's Mosque, forming part of the Jami el-Aqsa, is a well on the left of the great entrance called Bir el-Waraka, or Well of the Leaf. The story goes that during the caliphate of Omar, a man of the Bani Temim, named Sherik ibn Hayyan, dropped his bucket into this well, and climbing down to fetch it up found a door into which he entered. Great was his 422 surprise at seeing a beautiful garden, and having walked about in it for some time, plucked a leaf, and returned to tell his companions of his strange adventure. As the leaf never withered, and the door could never again be found, no doubt was entertained but that this was an entrance into paradise itself, and as such the well is now pointed out to the pilgrim. The bridge of Es-Sirat that will be extended on the day of judgment between heaven and hell is to start from Jerusalem, and the pilgrim is shown a column, built horizontally into the wall, which is to form its first pier. The Muslim guide will wax eloquent upon this, his favourite subject, the connection between the Day of Judgment and the Masjid el-Aqsa, and as the pilgrim stands upon the eastern wall, he will hear a circumstantial account of the troubles and the signal deliverance which shall come upon the true believers in the latter day. Dajjal, or Antichrist, he learns, will not be allowed to enter Jerusalem, but will stop on the eastern bank of the Jordan while the faithful remain on the western side. Then Christ, who will reappear to save the true believers, will take up 3 of the stones of Jerusalem, and will say as he takes up the first, "In the name of the God of Abraham," with the second, "In the name of the God of Isaac," and with the third, "In the name of the God of Jacob." He will then go out at the head of the Muslims, Dajjal will flee before him, and be slain by the 3 stones. The victors will then proceed to a general massacre of the Jews in and around the holy city, and every tree and every stone shall cry out and say, "I have a Jew beneath me, slay him." Having done this, the Messiah will break the crosses and kill the pigs, after which the millennium will set in. The last sign which is to precede the day of resurrection is that the Kaaba of Mecca shall be led as a bride to the Sacra of Jerusalem. When the latter sees it, it will 423 cry out, "Welcome, thou pilgrim to whom pilgrimages are made." No one dies until he has heard the sound of the muezzin in Jerusalem calling to prayer. The pilgrims to the Haram es-Sharif differ but little from those of the Holy Sepulchre. Both endure great hardships, exhibit intense devotion and ostentatious humility, and both believe that by scrupulous practice of the appointed rites and observances they are advancing a claim upon the favour of heaven which cannot be repudiated. Both delight in assuring themselves and others that it is love for the stones on which the saints have trodden which brings them there, but if their satisfaction could be analysed, it would be found to consist in a sense of religious security, which a learned Muslim doctor has quaintly expressed. The dwellers in Jerusalem are the neighbours of God, and God has no right to torment his neighbours. As with us in Europe, The only notices of Jerusalem during the Middle Ages are derived from the Crusaders and early pilgrims, so the various accounts of the Holy City, with the quaint stories and traditions attaching to it, with which Mohammed's writings teem, are all due to the early warriors and pilgrims of Islam. Of these, and their name is legion, I will select a few of the most eminent in order that the reader may form some idea of the sources from which the Arab historians have drawn their information. The Mohammedan pilgrims to Jerusalem range themselves naturally into two great classes or periods, namely, those who came over with the conqueror, Omar, or who visited the city between the date of his conquest and the Second Christian Kingdom, and those who were posterior to Saladin. Of all the Mohammedan pilgrims to Jerusalem, the first and most distinguished was Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, to whom, as has already been shown, the conquest of Jerusalem was due. 424 he died in the Great Plague at Amwas, Emmaus, AD 639, in the 58th year of his age, and was buried in the village of Athma at the foot of Jehel Ajlan, between Fucaris and El Dilieh, where his tomb is still pointed out. In this plague no less than 25,000 of the Muslim soldiery perished. Belal ibn Ruba, Mohammed's own muezzin, accompanied Omar to Jerusalem. He was so devoutly attached to the person of the Prophet that he refused to exercise his office after Mohammed's decease, except on the occasion of the conquest of the Holy City, when he was prevailed upon by the Caliph once more to call the people to prayers in honor of so great an occasion. Khalid ibn al-Walid, surnamed the Drawn Sword of God, was also present with the victorious army of Omar. He died in the year 641 AD and was buried, some say, at Emesa and others at Medina. Abudat ibn Samit, the first Kadhi of Jerusalem, arrived with Omar. He was buried in the Holy City, but his tomb disappeared during the Christian occupation. Another interesting member of the first pilgrim band was Salman al-Farsi, one of the early companions of Mohammed. Although he does not play a very conspicuous part in Mohammedan history, his name has acquired a strange celebrity in connection with the mysterious sect of the Nusayriye in Syria. The tenets of this people are so extraordinary and so little known that I cannot refrain from giving a slight account of them here. The Nusayriye worship a mystic triad, consisting of and represented by Ali, the son-in-law and successor of Mohammed, Mohammed himself, and Salman al-Farsi. These are alluded to as Ams, a mystical word composed of the three initial letters of their names, Ali being moreover called the mana or meaning, i.e., the object implied in all their teaching, Mohammed the chamberlain and Salman al-Farsi the door. To understand this, we 425 must remember that Eastern sovereigns are never approached except through the mediation of their chamberlains, and the three offices will therefore correspond with those of the Holy Trinity, the King of Kings, the Mediator, and the Door of Grace. From this triad proceed 5 other persons, called Atam or monads, whose function is that of creation and order. Their names are those of persons who played a conspicuous part in the early history of Islam, but they are evidently identical with the 5 planets known to the ancients, and their functions correspond exactly to those of the heathen deities whose names the planets bear. The Nusayriye hold the doctrine of a fall, believing that they originally existed as shining lights and brilliant stars, and that they were degraded from that higher state for refusing to recognize the omnipotence of Ali. The mystic trinity, Ams, is supposed to have appeared 7 times upon the earth, once in each of the 7 cycles into which the history of the world is divided. Each of these manifestations was in the persons of certain historical characters, and each avatar was accompanied by a similar incarnation of the antagonistic or evil principle. The devil of the Nusayriye is always represented as a triune being, and carrying out the principle of affiliating their religious system upon the history of Mohammedanism, they have made the opponents of Ali represent the personification of evil, as he himself and his immediate followers are the personification of good. Thus Abu Bakr, Omar, and Othman are considered by the Nusayriye as the conjunct incarnation of Satan. They believe in the transmigration of souls, and that after death those of Mohammedans will enter into the bodies of asses, Christians into pigs, and Jews into apes. As for their own sect, the wicked will become cattle and serve for food. The initiated who have given way to religious doubts will be changed into apes, and those who 426 are neither good nor bad will again become men, but will be born into a strange sect and people. The religion professed by the great mass of the Nusayriye is, indeed, a mere mélange of doctrines, dogmas, and superstitions, borrowed from the various creeds which have at various times been dominant in the country, and yet this incongruous jumble serves as a cloak for a much more interesting creed, namely, the ancient Saban faith. The Nusairiye conceal their religion from the outer world with the greatest care, and do not even initiate their own sons into its mysteries until they have arrived at years of discretion. The women are never initiated at all. In the first degree or stage of initiation, they are made acquainted with the doctrines of which I have given a sketch. In the second, they are told that by Ams the Christian Trinity is intended, and in the last or perfect degree, they are taught that this Trinity, the real object of their worship, is composed of light, or the sky, the sun, and the moon, the first being illimitable and infinite, the second proceeding from the first, and the last proceeding from the other two. The 5 monads are, in this stage, absolutely declared to be identical with the 5 planets. In their religious ceremonies they make use of hymns, libations of wine and sacrifices. To describe them in detail would be out of place in this work. I will therefore only mention one, which has an exceptional interest. Amongst the ceremonies observed at their great feast is one called the consecration of the fragrant herb. The officiating priest takes his seat in the midst of the assembly, and a white cloth, containing a kind of spice called marlab, camphor, and some sprigs of olive or fragrant herb, is then placed before him. 2 attendants then bring in a vessel filled with wine, and the master of the house in which the ceremony takes place, after appointing a 3rd person to minister to them, kisses their 427 hands all round, and humbly requests permission to provide the materials necessary for the feast. The high priest then, having prostrated himself upon the ground, and uttered a short invocation to certain mystic personages, distributes the sprigs of olive amongst the congregation, who rub them in their hands, and place them solemnly to their nose to inhale their fragrance. This ceremony would alone furnish evidence of the antiquity of the Nusairiye rites, for it is unquestionably the same as that alluded to by Ezekiel, Roman 8, v. 17, when condemning the idolatrous practices of the Jews. In that passage the prophet, after mentioning women weeping for Tammuz, the Syrian Adonis, 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces to the east, worshipping the sun in the east, and thus showing beyond question that the particular form of idolatry which he is condemning is the sun worship of Syria, concludes with the following words: "Is it a light thing which they commit here? For they have filled the land with violence and have returned to provoke me to anger, and lo, they put the branch to their nose." The more sober Muslim historians tell us that Salman el-Farsi died at the age of 98 or 99 years, but some do not scruple to assert that he was over 600 years old and had personally witnessed the ministry of Christ. Nothing certain seems to be known of him, except that he died in the year AD 656, and no reason appears for his deification by the Nusairiye, except the fact that he was a Persian and a friend of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Abu Dura is another of the companions of Mohammed, deified by the Nusairiye, in whose pantheon he appears as the representative of the planet Jupiter, and is also said to have entered Jerusalem with the army of Omar. He is buried at Medina. Sheddad ibn Oz. It is related that Mohammed, some little time before his death, predicted that Jerusalem 428 would be conquered, and that Sheddad and his sons after him would become imams or high priests there, which prediction came to pass. Sheddad died in Jerusalem, AD 678, at the age of 75, and was buried in the cemetery near the Bab-ur-Rahmah, close under the walls of the Haram-es-Sharif, where his tomb is still honored by the faithful. The Caliph Marwiyah also visited Jerusalem before his accession to the throne, and it was in that city that the celebrated compact was made between him and Mir ibn el to revenge the murder of Othman. He died in Damascus on the 1st of May, AD 680. One of the most distinguished of Mohammedan pilgrims to Jerusalem was Ka'ab el-Ahbar ibn Mani, the Himyarite, familiarly called Abu Ishaq. He was by birth a Jew, but had embraced the Muslim religion during the caliphate of Abu Bakr, in consequence, as he alleged, of his finding in the Book of the Law a prophecy relating to Mohammed. He is chiefly remembered as having pointed out to Omar, whom he accompanied to Jerusalem, the real position of the Sacra. The following tradition is also ascribed to him, that Jerusalem once complained to the Almighty that she had been so frequently destroyed, to which God answered, "Be comforted, for I will fill thee instead with worshippers, who shall flock to thee as the vultures to their nests, and shall yearn for thee as the doves for their eggs." He died at Homs in AD 652. Selim ibn Qaysar was one of the companions of Mohammed, and acted as governor of Jerusalem under the Caliph Marwiyah. The position of women amongst the first professors of Islam appears to have been much more honorable than amongst their later successors, and the early annals of the Creed contain many notices of gifted and pious women who appeared to have exercised no small influence over the minds of their contemporaries. One of these distinguished 429 females was el-Khair, a freed woman of the noble family of Agil and a native of Bassora. She visited Jerusalem, where she died about the year 752. Her tomb is still to be seen on the Mount of Olives, in a retired corner south of the Chapel of the Ascension, and is much frequented by pilgrims. It is related that el-Khair one day in the course of her devotions cried out, "O God, wilt thou consume with fire a heart that loves thee so?" When a mysterious voice replied to her, "Nay, we act not thus, entertain not such evil suspicions of us." The precept, "Conceal your virtues as you would your vices," is also attributed to the same saint. Safia bint Hai, known as the Mother of the Faithful, was amongst the earliest pilgrims to Jerusalem, having visited it with the army of Omar. To her is attributed the tradition that the division of the wicked from the good on the Day of Judgment will take place from the top of the Mount of Olives. She died about the year 670. An anecdote related of the celebrated Sufyan eth-Thawri affords a good example of the devotion and fervor of these early Mohammedan pilgrims. He is said to have repeated the whole of the Quran at one sitting in the Kabat-e-Sakra, and on one occasion, when he had prayed until he was completely exhausted, he bought a single plantain and ate it in the shade of the mosque, apologizing for even this indulgence by the remark, "The ass can do more work when he has got his fodder." He died at Basra AD 777. Al-Imam Shafi'i, one of the most learned of the Mohammedan doctors, and the founder of one of the chief sects into which the religion is divided. He was born in 767 AD, the same year in which Abu Hanifa, the founder of the Hanafite sect, died. His works, which are very voluminous, and considered by his followers as next in authority to the Quran itself, are said to have been all written within the space of 4 years. The following fatwa, or legal decision, attributed to him 430 during his stay at Jerusalem, not only evinces the great erudition and readiness for which he was so celebrated, but affords an amusing specimen of the trifling minutiae upon which the Mohammedan doctors often consent to dispute. Having established himself in the Haram-Sharif, he professed himself ready to answer any question that might be put to him, concerning either the Quran or the Sunnah, that is, the written or oral law. "What should you say," said a person present, "respecting the legality of killing a wasp when one is engaged in the rites of the pilgrimage?" Without a moment's hesitation the Imam replied, "The Quran itself tells us that we are to accept whatsoever the Prophet hath granted us, and to abstain from what he has forbidden us." Quran 59:7. Now Ibn Ayyana had it from Abd el-Malik ibn Amir, who had it from Huzaifa, that the Prophet said, "Be guided in all things by my immediate successors, Abu Bakr and Omar." But Ibn Ayyana further relates that Masud told him that Qais ibn Muzalim was informed by Tariq ibn Shihab that Omar bade the pilgrim slay the wasp. Shafi'i died at Karafa-Sugra in Egypt on the 20th December, AD 819. Muhammad ibn Karam, the founder of the Karamiya sect, resided at Jerusalem for more than 20 years, and died there in the year 869 AD. His doctrines are considered by the majority of Mussulmans as heterodox and pernicious. He was said to have been buried by the Jericho Gate, near the tombs of the prophets, but neither the gate nor the sheikh's tomb exist at the present day. Abu al-Faraj al-Muqaddasi, Imam of the Hanbali sect, and the founder of that of Imam Ahmed. He is the author of very esteemed and voluminous works upon theology and jurisprudence. He died the 9th of January, 1094, and was buried at Damascus, in the cemetery near the Bab-es-Saghir, where his tomb is still frequented by the faithful. 431 Sheikh Abu el-Fath Nasser, a celebrated recluse and theologian, fixed his residence at Jerusalem, living the life of an ascetic in the building to the east of the Bab-en-Rama, which was called after him En-Nasiriyeh. He was a friend of the eminent philosopher el-Ghazali, whom he met at Damascus. He died in the last named city in the year 1097 AD. Abu el-Ma'ali al-Musharraf ibn el-Marjan Ibrahim el-Muqaddi. He is the author of a celebrated treatise upon the history and antiquities of Jerusalem, entitled Fadhil Beit el-Muqaddas W.E. Sakra, The Virtues of Jerusalem and of the Rock. Little or nothing is known of him beyond this composition. The date of his decease is also uncertain, but it is ascertained that he was contemporary with Sheikh Abu el-Qasim, who was born about 1040 AD. This Sheikh Abu el-Qasim Rumili was a celebrated doctor of the Shafi'ite sect. He established himself at Jerusalem and was so renowned for his great knowledge of religious jurisprudence that difficult points of law from all quarters of the Muslim world were sent to him for his opinion, and his decision was always considered final. He is also the author of an excellent treatise on the history of Jerusalem. On the capture of the city by the Crusaders in the year 1099, he was taken prisoner, and his ransom fixed at 1,000 dinars. The Muslims did not, however, appear to set a very high value upon their learned doctor, for the sum demanded for his release was never raised, and the reverend gentleman was stoned to death by the Franks at the gate of Antioch. Some authorities say that he was put to death in Jerusalem. Abu el-Qasim Razi was by birth a Persian, and studied jurisprudence at Ispahan, from which place he removed to Baghdad, and ultimately proceeded to Jerusalem, where he adopted the life of a religious recluse. He was slain by the Crusaders on their entry into Jerusalem in July 1099. 432 The renowned philosopher El-Ghazali himself was also a pilgrim to Jerusalem, in which city he composed the magnificent work for which he is chiefly celebrated, namely the Mahi el-Ulam, the resuscitation of science. He occupied the same apartments in which Sheikh Nasir had formerly resided, and the name was changed in consequence from that of En-Nasiriye to El-Ghazaliye. The building, however, has long since disappeared. El-Ghazali died at Tus, his native town, in the year 1112. Dir ed-Din Isa studied Mohammedan literature and jurisprudence in Aleppo, and was attached to the court of Izz ed-Din Shirkuh, Saladin's uncle, with whom he visited Egypt. On the death of the former, it was principally owing to the exertions made by him and Bahar ed-Din Karakash that Saladin was appointed to succeed him as Grand Vizier of Egypt. In the year 753, Dir ed-Din accompanied Saladin upon an expedition against the Franks, in the course of which he was taken prisoner, though subsequently ransomed for 60,000 dinars. He was a great favourite with Saladin, and, as has been before mentioned, preached the first sermon in the Masjid el-Aqsa after the conquest of the Holy City. He was of noble birth and great learning, and while accompanying Saladin in his holy war, he combined the ecclesiastical with the military character, wearing the armour and uniform of a soldier and the turban of a priest. He died during the siege of Acre in the year 583, and his remains were sent to Jerusalem and buried in the cemetery of Mamilla. Sheikh Shehab ed-Din el-Qudsi was also a khatib or preacher in Jerusalem. He was present with Saladin at the taking of the city and received the sobriquet of Abu Tor, the father of the bull, because he was in the habit of riding upon one of those animals and fighting from its back. Saladin bestowed upon him a small village near the Jaffa Gate, in which was the monastery of St. 433 Mark, where he lived and died. Both the monastery and the hill upon which it stands are now called after him, Abu Tor. It is related of him that when he wanted any provisions he used to write an order and tie it on the neck of his favourite bull, which would go straight to the bazaars and bring back the articles required. After the death of Saladin, the list of eminent Muslims whose names are connected with the history of Jerusalem becomes too formidable in its dimensions to admit of more than a brief notice of a few of the most important. I will commence with the kings and princes. El-Melik el-Mozum was a son of El-Adil, Saladin's brother, and succeeded his father in the government of Syria. In August 1218 AD he was a Hanefite, departing in this from the traditions of his house, which had all along professed the doctrines of Izz Shafi, and founded a college for the sect in the Masjid el-Aqsa. He was a great patron of Arabic philosophy, and erected the building called the Dome of the Grammarians, on the south side of the Court of the Sacra. To him is also due the construction of the greater number of carved wooden doors which adorn the Haram building and which still bear his name. We have already alluded in a former chapter to the operations of this prince and his brother El-Melik el-Kamil against the Franks, as well as to the invasion of the Khwarezmians and other troubles which overtook Jerusalem. After this we hear no more of victories or crusades, and the connection of the succeeding princes with the history of Jerusalem is chiefly derived from their benefactions to the Haram-Izz Sharif. I will mention only a few of these, whose munificence is recorded on the numerous tablets which adorn the buildings in the sacred area. El-Melik ed-Dahir Baybars, Sultan of Egypt, visited Jerusalem in 1269, on his return from a pilgrimage to Mecca, passing by the Red Hill, between Jericho and 434 Jerusalem, which is, according to the Muslims, the traditional site of Moses' grave. He erected the building to which devotees yearly flock in crowds to the present day. He repaired the Mosque el-Aqsa and the Kubbat-Izz Silsila, and completely renovated the interior of the Kubbat-Izz Sacra, which was in a very dilapidated condition. He died at Damascus in June 1277. Izz Sultan Kalawan, originally a Memluk, purchased for 1,000 dinars, ascended the throne of Egypt in 1279. He repaired the roof of the Jami el-Aqsa and erected a cloister called el-Mansuri near the Bab en-Nazir. El-Melik el-Adil Ketbegha began to reign in 694 and repaired the eastern wall of the Haram by the Golden Gate. Sultan Lajin, who succeeded him, also executed many repairs in the mosque. Sultan Mohammed, son of Kalayan, who had succeeded his father, but been twice compelled to abdicate, at last succeeded in establishing himself on the throne of Egypt in AD 1310. He repaired the south wall of the Haram, coated the inside of the mosque with marble, and regilded the domes of El-Aqsa and the Kubbat-Sacra. So beautifully was this gilding executed, that Mejured-Din, writing 180 years afterwards, declares that it looked as though it had been but just laid on. Even now, in the records of Saladin's restoration which exist upon the dome of the Kubbat-Sacra, and over the mihrab of the Aqsa, the gold remains untarnished. Mohammed ibn Khalyan also repaired the arches over the steps leading up on the north side to the platform on which the dome of the rock stands, and executed many useful works in and around Jerusalem. He died in AD 1340. Sultan el-Melik el-Ashraf Shaban, grandson of the preceding, repaired the Bal el-Esbat, put new wooden doors in the Jami el-Aqsa, and repaired the arches over 435 the steps on the west side of the Sacra platform by the Bab en-Nazir. Sultan Abu Sa'id Barkuk was the first of the Circassian dynasty in Egypt. He ascended the throne in 1382. To him is due a portion of the woodwork around the Sacra. In 1393, his lieutenant el-Yaghmiri came to Jerusalem and set right the numerous abuses which had crept into the administration of the city in the time of his predecessor. These reforms he proclaimed by causing an account of them to be engraved upon a marble tablet and hung up in the Haram-Sharif. The governors of Jerusalem would seem to have been rather prone to relapses in this respect, for we find al-Yaghmiri's example followed by many of the succeeding viceroys. Sultan en-Nasir Faj succeeded to the throne of Egypt in the year 1399, when only 12 years old. He separated the government of Jerusalem and Hebron from that of Mecca and Medina, which had hitherto been exercised by one official. During his reign occurred the incursions of the Tartars under Timur or Tamerlane. Sultan el-Melik el-Ashraf Barsibay, a freedman of Barkuk, becoming sultan in 1422, followed his former master's example and expended some money upon the repair of the mosque at Jerusalem. He presented a beautiful copy of the Quran to the mosque of El-Aqsa and appointed and endowed a reader and attendant to look after it. In the year 1447, during the reign of el-Melik ed-Dahir Chakmak, a portion of the roof of the Kubbat-Sacra was destroyed by fire. Some say the accident was caused by lightning, others by the carelessness of some young noblemen who clambered into the roof in pursuit of pigeons and set fire to the woodwork with a lighted candle which one of them held in his hands. The Sultan repaired the damage and also presented to the Sacra a large and magnificent copy of the Quran. This prince was 436 a great champion of the faith and sent his agent, Sheikh Mohammed al-Mushmar, to Jerusalem for the purpose of destroying all the newly erected Christian buildings in the place, and of clearing out the monasteries and convents. Some new wooden balustrading which was found in the church of the Holy Sepulchre was carried off in triumph to the mosque of El-Aqsa, and the monastery, or tomb of David, was cleared of its monkish occupants and appropriated by the Mohammedans, while even the bones in the adjoining cemetery were dug up and removed. The so-called Tomb of David was originally a convent of Franciscan monks, who believed it to be the site of the cenaculum, and their traditions mention nothing of an underground cavern such as is now said by the Mohammedans to exist. The tradition which makes it the Tomb of David is purely Muslim in its origin, and does not date back earlier than the time of el-Melik ed-Dahir Chakmak. Oral tradition in Jerusalem says that a beggar came one day to the door of the monastery asking for relief, and in revenge for being refused went about declaring that it was the Tomb of David, in order to incite the Muslim fanatics to seize upon and confiscate the spot. His plan, as we have just seen, succeeded. El-Ashraf also gave a great Quran to the Jami el-Aqsa, which was placed near the Mosque of Omar, by the window which overlooks Siloam. Sultan el-Ashraf Katibai, in the year 1472, widened and improved the steps leading up to the platform of the Sacra, and furnished them with arches like those on the other sides. He also recovered the roof of El-Aqsa with lead. A notice of the events which happened in Jerusalem during the reign of this sovereign will be found in the account of Mejured-Din, p. 439. The names of a great number of learned men are mentioned in the Mohammedan histories of Jerusalem, either as pilgrims or as preachers, kadhis or principals. 437 of colleges. Of these the majority would be unknown to, or possess but little interest for, the European reader. I will therefore content myself with mentioning a few who have written upon or otherwise distinguished themselves in connection with the Holy City. Sheikh el-Islam Burhanuddin, chief Kadhi of Jerusalem, died in 1388. The marble pulpit in the Kubbat-e-Sakra, from which the sermon is preached on feast days, was the gift of this divine. Sayyid Bedruddin Salem, a lineal descendant of Ali ibn Abi Talib, was also connected for some time with the Haram at Jerusalem. He was esteemed a great saint, and was visited as such by pious Muslims even during his lifetime. Many miracles are recorded of him, and it is said that the birds and wild beasts came to make pilgrimages to his tomb and those of his sons, at Sharafat in the Wadi an-Nusa, about 3 days' journey from Jerusalem, and prostrate themselves with their faces on the ground at the door of the small building which covers the graves. They are still objects of great veneration to Muslim pilgrims in Palestine. Sheikh Abu el-Hasan al-Maghfari exercised the office of Khatib, or preacher, in Jerusalem. He studied the celebrated history of the city by Ibn Asakir, under the direction of its author, in AD 1200. Shemseddin el-Alami accepted the office of chief Kadhi of Jerusalem in 1438, towards the end of the reign of Sultan Barsabai. An incident is related in the notices of his life, which throws some light upon the condition of the Christians in the city. A church of large dimensions, and furnished with a magnificent dome, existed on the south side of the Holy Sepulchre, in close proximity to the Haram-es-Sharif. This was a favorite place of worship with the Christian inhabitants, and the chanting of the priests could be heard in the Kubbat-es-Sakra itself, to the great scandal of the faithful. While they were concerting measures for putting a stop to the services 438 without infringing the law, an earthquake happened, which threw down the dome of the church, and completely dismantled the building. The Christians applied to the governor of the city, and the Kadhi of the Hanafite sect for permission to restore the building, and by dint of heavy bribes obtained it. El-Alami, who was Kadhi of the Hanbalite sect, was furious at this, and declared that as the church had been destroyed by the act of God for the express convenience of the Muslim worshippers in the Kubbat-es-Sakra, it was sheer blasphemy to allow it to be rebuilt. An indignant letter written by him to Cairo brought a special commissioner with orders from the Sultan el-Ashraf Ainul to stop the building and pull down what had been already erected. This was probably the commencement of the general crescentade against the churches and monasteries of Jerusalem, which took place under the jurisdiction of el-Alami in the reign of Sultan Chakmak, to which I have already alluded in my notice of that prince. The Kadhi was also in the habit of seizing upon the children of deceased Jews and Christians, who were tributaries of the state, and of compelling them to be trained up in the Mohammedan religion. The Shafi'ite Kadhi disputed the legality of this, and the question was warmly disputed by the Mohammedan doctors, both in Jerusalem and Cairo. Although the decision was not favorable to his view of the case, he continued to follow the same course until he was removed from the office in 1468. Amongst the Mohammedan viceroys and governors of Jerusalem may be mentioned the following: El-Emir Ezzeddin-e-Zanjili, who repaired the Kubbat el-Muraj in the year 1200, El-Emir Hisameddin, who restored the Kubbat-en-Nawiway in 1207. El-Emir Zadugdi was governor of Jerusalem during the reigns of the Sultans Baybars and Kalahan. He built a cloister by the Bab-in-Nazir and paved the court of the Sakra. El-Emir Nasireddin made extensive restorations in the Haram 439 area and opened the 2 windows in the Aqsa, which are on the right and left of the mihrab, and coated the interior of the mosque with marble in 1330. The well-known author, Mejureddin, resided for some time in Jerusalem and has given us the best history of the Holy City extant in Arabic. The following is a brief extract of his own very graphic account of the events which happened there during the reign of the Sultan el-Ashraf Katibai, in whose service the writer was. As a picture of the state of things in Jerusalem in the 15th century, it may not prove uninteresting to our readers. In the year 1468, a severe famine occurred in Jerusalem and its neighborhood in consequence of the unusual drought of the preceding winter. The people began to exhibit signs of dissatisfaction, and matters were not improved by a quarrel which took place between the Nazir el-Haramain, or superintendent of the 2 sanctuaries, Hebron and Jerusalem, and the Naib, or viceroy. These 2 officials came to an open rupture, and as the Nazir and his men were engaged in laying in water from the Birkat-es-Sultan to some buildings upon which they were employed, the Naib with a company of attendants came suddenly upon them, and a fierce fight took place. The city was immediately divided into 2 factions, some taking the part of the Nazir and others of the Naib, and even the presence of a special commissioner from Cairo failed to quell the disturbance. The plague, with which Syria had been for some time visited, next attacked Jerusalem and raged from the 17th of July, 1469, until the middle of September. The next year, 1470, was more propitious, but the great people of the city still seemed unable to agree. On the 12th of February, Kadhi Shurf-ed-Din came to Jerusalem and was visited immediately on his arrival by Gharz-ed-Din, chief Kadhi of the Shafi'ite sect, now Sheikh Shehab-ed-Din el-Amiri, principal of one of the 440 colleges attached to the Haram, also happened to drop in, and either through ignorance or inadvertence, took a seat in the assembly above the Kadhi. The two reverend gentlemen entered into a warm dispute, in the course of which the Sheikh threatened to tear the Kadhi's turban off his head. The Kadhi retorted that the Sheikh did not know the meaning of a turban, implying that he did not know how to conduct himself as became his office. Both parties then left the assembly, and the matter being referred to arbitration, certain learned gentlemen adjourned to the Kubbat-e-Sakra to discuss it, accompanied by a crowd of idlers. The people of Jerusalem, determined to defend their fellow citizen, attempted to decide the question by pillaging the Kadhi's house and maltreating his wives. The day was a very rainy one, which circumstance increased the bad temper of the mob, and it was at one time more than probable that the sanctuary would become the scene of anarchy and bloodshed. In a subsequent appeal, made to the Sultan himself at Cairo, the Kadhi got scant satisfaction, and was so laughed at and ridiculed on his return to Jerusalem that he was ultimately obliged to resign his office and leave. The atmosphere of Jerusalem appears to have a particularly unfortunate effect upon the temper of theologians. The winter of 1472-3 was exceedingly severe, and the rains so incessant that the foundations of the buildings were, in many instances, undermined. 360 houses are said to have fallen down from this cause, but one woman who was buried in the ruins of her dwelling was the only person killed. About the end of the year 1475, the Sultan himself, El-Ashraf Katibai, performed the pilgrimage to Jerusalem on his return from Mecca. Immediately upon his arrival in the city he held a court, on which occasion the inhabitants crowded round him to present petitions against the viceroy, whom they accused of all manner of injustice and 441 oppression. The chief Kadhi was also included in the indictment, as having given corrupt decisions in the interests of the governor. The latter purchased immunity by paying off upon the spot all claims that were made against him, and was retained in his office by the Sultan, who, however, intimated that if a single complaint were again made he would have him cut in halves. The Kadhi narrowly escaped corporal punishment, and was dismissed ignominiously from his office, and compelled to leave the city. In May 1476, orders came from the Sultan to arrest all the Christians connected with the churches of the Holy Sepulchre, Sion and Bethlehem, in revenge for the capture of 4 Muslims by the Franks at Alexandria. The orders were executed, but we are not told what became of the prisoners. Towards the end of 1477, the plague, which had been raging for some time in Syria, reached Jerusalem and lasted for more than 6 months, causing a terrible mortality. In 1480, a great disturbance took place in Jerusalem in consequence of the governor having imprisoned and put to death some Bedouin of the Bani Zaid tribe. A crowd of ferocious Arabs bore down upon Jerusalem determined to revenge the death of their comrades, and the governor, who was riding outside the city at the time of their arrival, narrowly escaped falling into their hands. Setting spurs to his horse, he dashed through the Bab el-Esbat, rode across the courtyard of the mosque, and escaped through the Bab el-Magharibe. The Bedouin swarmed in after him with drawn swords, utterly regardless of the sacred character of the place. Finding that their victim had escaped, they followed the method adopted on similar occasions by European agitators, broke into the houses and shops of the neighborhood, and plundered all that they could lay their hands on, and then broke open the jail and let loose the prisoners. 442, in 1481, a number of architects and workmen were sent to Jerusalem by the Sultan to repair the Haram, and to rebuild the various colleges which had fallen into decay. In 1482, a messenger arrived bearing the Sultan's order that the Christians were to be permitted to take possession once more of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and exhibit therein the customary Easter pyrotechnic display. The order was at first disputed by the Muslim officials, but as the commissioner threatened to indict them for contempt of authority, they were obliged to give way. In 1491, Jerusalem was again visited by the plague. At first from 30 to 40 people died of it daily, but in a little time the average rate of mortality was increased to 130. The winter of this year was very severe, and a snowstorm occurred which lasted several days and lay upon the ground to the depth of 3 feet, greatly incommoding and frightening the inhabitants. When it began to melt, the foundations of many of the houses gave way, and serious disasters were the result. Mejured-Din's history of this period is very diffuse, and is chiefly devoted to an account of the various Kadhis and other religious or legal functionaries in Jerusalem. But the ascendancy of the Shafi'ite or Hanefite doctrines, or the intense devotion of an old gentleman who had learned a whole commentary upon the Koran by heart, are not subjects of much general interest. We have, therefore, confined ourselves to stating the few facts above detailed. We ought perhaps to include in our list of Mohammedan pilgrims those from whom all our information is gleaned, Ibn Asakir, and the later Arabic writers who have written on the subject. Their names, however, and the names of their books, although of high authority to the Oriental scholar, could have but little weight with the English reader. Chapter 18. The Chronicle of 600 Years. Oh, yet we trust that somehow good will be the final goal of ill. To pangs of nature, sins of will, defects of doubt and taint of blood. In memoriam. The Christian kingdom, reduced after Saladin's conquest to a strip of land along the coast, with a few strong cities, depended no longer on the annual reinforcement of pilgrims, but on the strength and wealth of the two military orders. Unfortunately, these quarrelled, and the whole of Syria became divided, Mohammedans as well as Christians, into partisans of Knights Templars, or of Knights Hospitallers. Henry of Champagne, the titular king, was only anxious to get away, while Bohemond, the Prince of Antioch, was only anxious to extend his own territories. In Germany alone the crusading spirit yet lingered, and a few Germans flocked yearly to the sacred places. Germany did more. The emperor, with 40,000 men, went to Palestine by way of Italy. When he arrived, he found, to his amazement, that the Christians did not want him. The truce concluded with the Mohammedans being not yet broken. The barons and princes had resolved not to break it at all, but rather to seek its renewal. But the Germans had not accomplished their long journey for 444 nothing. They issued from their camp at Acre in arms and broke the truce by wantonly attacking the Saracens. Reprisals at once followed as a matter of course. Jaffa was attacked. Henry of Champagne hastened to its defense. There he fell from a high window and was killed. The arrival of more crusaders enabled the Christians to meet el-Melik el-Dil in open field, and to gain a complete victory. They followed it up by taking the seaboard towns, and the whole coast of Syria was once more in the hands of the Christians. Of Jerusalem no one thought except the common soldiers, with whom the capture of the city remained still a dream. Isabel, the widow of Henry, was married a fourth time, to Amaury de Lusignan, who had succeeded his brother Guy on the throne of Cyprus, and now became the titular king of Jerusalem, a shadowy title which was destined never to become a real one, except for a very brief interval. When the Germans went away, the Christians of Palestine were once more at the mercy of the Saracens, with whom they had broken the treaty. The Bishop of Acre was sent to supplicate help from Europe. He was shipwrecked and drowned almost immediately after leaving port. Other messengers were sent. These also were drowned in a tempest. So for a long time news of the sad condition of the Christians did not reach Europe. But indeed it was difficult to raise the crusading spirit again in the West. Like a flame of dry straw, it had burned fiercely for a short time, and then expired. Jerusalem was fading from the minds of the people. It was become a city of memories, round which the glories of those myths which gathered about the name of Godfrey and Tancred were already present. Innocent Roman III, a young and ardent pope, wrote letter upon letter. These produced little effect. He sent preachers to promise men remission of sins in return for taking the cross, but it was a time when men were not thinking much about their sins. Priests imposed the penance 445 of pilgrimage to Palestine, but it does not appear that many pilgrims went, and boxes were placed in all the churches to collect money, but it is not certain that much money was put into them. Then Fulk de Neuilly, the most eloquent priest of the time, was sent to preach a crusade, and succeeded in fanning the embers of the crusading enthusiasm once more into an evanescent and short-lived flame. How little of religious zeal there was in the movement may be judged by the sequel, and we cannot here delay to detail the progress of the crusade, which ended in the conquest of Constantinople. No history can be found more picturesque, more full of incident, and more illustrative of the manners and thoughts of the time, but it does not concern Jerusalem. An old empire fell, and a new one was founded, but Christendom was outraged by the spectacle of an expedition which started full of zeal for the conquest of the Holy Land, and was diverted from its original purposes to serve the ambition of its leaders and the avarice of a commercial city. Egypt and Syria, meantime, were kept quiet from war by troubles not caused by man. The Nile ceased for a time to overflow, and a fearful famine, a famine of which the records speak as dreadful beyond all comparison, set in. During this, men kept themselves alive by eating the flesh of those who died, while the cities were filled with corpses, and the river bore down on its tide dead bodies as numerous as the lilies which bloom on its surface in spring. And before the famine, which extended over Syria as well, had ceased, an earthquake shook the country from end to end. Damascus, Tyre, Nablus were heaps of ruins. The walls of Acre and Tripoli fell down. Jerusalem alone seemed spared, and there the Christian and the Mohammedan met together, still trembling with fear, to thank God for their safety. The sums of money which Fulk de Neuilly had raised in his preaching were spent in repairing the walls which had fallen, and the knights sent messengers in all directions to implore the assistance of the West. 446 Amory, a wise and prudent chief, died, leaving an infant son who also died a few days after him, and Isabel was a widow for the fourth time. Pope Innocent Roman III could find none to go to the Holy Land but those whom he ordered to go by way of penance. Thus the murderers of Conrad, Bishop of Würzburg, were enjoined to bear arms for 4 years against the Saracens. They were to wear no garments of bright colours, never to assist at public sports, not to marry, to march barefooted and dressed in woolen, to fast on bread and water 2 days in the week, and whenever they came to a city to go to the church with bare backs, a rope round the neck and rods in the hand, there to receive flagellation. But their penance was not so cruel as that inflicted on the luckless Fratmund, described above p. 124. Another criminal, one Robert, a knight, went to the Pope and confessed that while a captive in Egypt during the dreadful famine, he had killed his wife and child, and kept himself alive by eating their flesh. The Pope ordered him to pass 3 years in the Holy Land. The crown of Jerusalem devolved by the death of Amaury de Lusignan on the daughter of Isabel by her husband Conrad of Tyre. The barons, looking for a fit husband to share the throne with her, that is, to become their leader in war, selected John de Brienne. He was recommended by the King of France as a man good in arms, safe in war, and provident in business. And hopes were held out that another crusade would be sent from France. On the strength of this expectation, the Templars, in spite of contrary advice from the Hospitallers, broke the truce which yet existed with the Mahometans, and open war began again. King John de Brienne came with an army of 300 knights and no more. Fortresses and towns were taken. The Christians began to drop off and desert the falling country, and the new king soon found himself with no place that he could call his 447 own, except the city of Acre. He sent to the Pope for assistance. The Pope could not help him, because there was a new and much easier crusade on the point of commencing, that against the Albiges. And then happened that most wonderful episode in all this tangled story, the Crusade of the Children, Expeditio Nugatoria, Expeditio Derisoria. It had long been the deliberate opinion of many ecclesiastics that the misfortunes of the Christian kingdom, and the failure of so many crusades, were due to the impure lives of the Christian soldiers. Since the first crusade it had been the constant and laudable aim of the Church to maintain among the Croises a feeling that personal purity was the first requisite in an expedition inspired solely by religious zeal. All their efforts were vain, laws were made, which were broken at once. Shameful punishments were threatened, of which no one took any notice. Even the camp of St. Louis himself was filled with every kind of immorality, while that of Richard's crusade, spite of the strictest laws, became the scene of profligacy the most unbridled. For every one crusader in the later expeditions who was moved by a spirit of piety, there might be found 99 who took the cross for love of fighting, for the sake of their seigneurs, for sheer desire of change, for a release from serfdom, for getting away from the burden of wife and family, for the chance of plunder and license, and for every other unworthy excuse. Thus it was that the religious wars fostered and promoted vice, and the failure of army after army was looked on as a clear manifestation of God's wrath against the sins of the camp. This feeling was roused to its highest pitch when, in the year 1212, certain priests, Nicholas was the name of one of these mischievous madmen, went about France and Germany calling on the children to perform what the fathers, through their wickedness, had been unable to effect, promising that the sea should be dry to enable them to march across, that the Saracens would be 448 miraculously stricken with a panic at sight of them, that God would, through the hands of children only whose lives were yet pure, work the recovery of the cross and the sepulchre. Thousands, it is said 50,000, children of both sexes responded to the call. They listened to the impassioned preaching of the monks, believed their lying miracles, their visions, their portents, their references to the scriptures, and in spite of all that their parents could do, rushed to take the cross, boys and girls together, and streamed along the roads which led to Marseille and Genoa, singing hymns, waving branches, replying to those who asked whither they were going. "We go to Jerusalem to deliver the Holy Sepulchre," and shouting their rallying cry, "Lord Jesus, give us back thy holy cross." They admitted whoever came, provided he took the cross, the infection spread, and the children could not be restrained from joining them in the towns and villages along their route. Their miserable parents put them in prison, they escaped, they forbade them to go, the children went in spite of prohibition. They had no money, no provisions, no leaders, but the charity of the towns they passed through supported them. At their rear streamed the usual tale of camp followers, those people who lived wherever soldiers were found, following in the track of the army like vultures, to prey on the living, and to rob the dead. Of these there came many, ribauds et ribauds, corrupting the boys, and robbing them of their little means, so that long before the army reached the shores of the Mediterranean, the purity of many was gone forever. There were two main bodies. One of these directed its way through Germany, across the Alps to Genoa. On the road they were robbed of all the gifts which had been presented them. They were exposed to heat and want, and very many either died on the march or wandered away from the road, and so became lost to sight. When they reached Italy they dispersed about the country seeking food, were 449 stripped by the villagers, and in some cases reduced to slavery. Only 7,000 out of their number arrived at Genoa. Here they stayed for some days. They looked down upon the Mediterranean, hoping that its bright waters would divide to let them pass, but they did not. There was no miracle wrought in their favour. A few of noble birth were received among the Genoese families, and have given rise to distinguished houses of Genoa. Among them is the house of Vivaldi. The rest, disappointed and disheartened, made their way back again and got home at length, the girls with the loss of their virtue, the boys with the loss of their belief, all barefooted and in rags, laughed at by the towns they went through, and wondering why they had ever gone at all. This was the end of the German army. That of the French was not so fortunate, for none of them ever got back again at all. When they arrived at Marseille, thinned probably by the same causes as those which had dispersed the Germans, they found, like their brethren, that the sea did not open a path for them, as had been promised. Perhaps some were disheartened and went home again, but fortune appeared to favour them. There were two worthy merchants at Marseille, named Hugh Ferrius and William Porcus, Iron Hugh and Pig William, who traded with the East, and had in port 7 ships, in which they proposed to convey the children to Palestine. With a noble generosity they offered to take them for nothing, all for love of religion, and out of the pure kindness of their hearts. Of course this offer was accepted with joy, and the 7 vessels, laden with the happy little crusaders, singing their hymns, and flying their banners, sailed out from Marseille, bound for the East, accompanied by William the Good and Hugh the Pious. It was not known to the children, of course, that the chief trade of these merchants was the lucrative business of kidnapping Christian children for the Alexandrian market. It 450 was so, however, and these respectable tradesmen had never before made so splendid a coup. Unfortunately, off the island of St. Peter, they encountered bad weather, and 2 ships went down with all on board. What must have been the feelings of the philanthropists, Pig William and Iron Hugh, at this misfortune? They got, however, 5 ships safely to Alexandria, and sold all their cargo, the Sultan of Cairo buying 40 of the boys, whom he brought up carefully and apart, intending them doubtless for his best soldiers. A dozen, refusing to change their faith, were martyred. None of the rest ever came back. Nobody in Europe seems to have taken much notice of this extraordinary episode, and its memory has so entirely died out that hardly a mention of it is found in any modern history of the period. Thousands of children perished. Probably their mothers wept, but no one else seems to have cared, and the Pope built a church on the island of St. Peter to commemorate the drowning of the innocents, with the cold remark that the children were doing what the men refused to do. It is, however, pleasing to add that the 2 honest merchants were accused some years afterwards of conspiring to assassinate the Emperor Frederick, and so perished on the gallows tree. In 1213, after the Children's Crusade, Innocent essayed once more to wake the enthusiasm of Christendom. He promised, as before, remission of sins to those who took the cross. He wrote to the sultans of Damascus and Cairo, informing them that the Crusaders were coming, and urged on them the advisability of giving up Jerusalem peaceably. And he informed the world that Islam was the beast of the apocalypse, whose duration was to be 660 years, of which 600 were already past. Some, no doubt, of his hearers thought that, such being the case, they might very well be quiet for 60 years more. At the same time he wrote to the Patriarch of Jerusalem with strict injunctions to 451 effect, if possible, a reform in the morals of the Syrian Christians, as if that were a hopeful or even a possible task, And as before, preaching was ordered through every diocese, and collecting boxes for every church. In England the preaching was a total failure. John saw a means of reconciling himself with the church and took the cross. But the barons in their turn excommunicated, held aloof, and occupied themselves with their home affairs. Philip Augustus of France, after giving the 40th part of his wealth to the expenses of the crusade, quarrelled with the Cardinal de Kirchen over the powers which he assumed to possess as the legate of the Pope. In Germany, Frederick Roman II, recently crowned King of the Romans, took the cross in the hope of preserving the support of the Church, Otho, his rival, being at war with the Pope. Then came the Council of Lateran, at which Innocent presided. He spoke of Jerusalem and the Holy Land. His address was received without any marks of enthusiasm. Nevertheless, a crusade was actually undertaken, partly against the Prussians, partly to Palestine. The latter was led by Andrew, King of Hungary. It was conveyed in Venetian ships from Spalatro and the towns of the Adriatic first to Cyprus, where they were joined by the deputies of the king and patriarch, and the military orders. Thence they sailed to Acre, where they landed in 1217. Like all the crusading armies, this was too big to be manageable, too diverse in its composition to be subject to discipline, too unruly to be led, and under too many leaders. They marched straight across Palestine, avoiding Jerusalem and the south. They bathed in the Jordan and wandered along the banks of the Sea of Galilee, singing hymns, making prisoners, and plundering the towns, the Saracens not striking a blow. Their only military exploit was an attempt on Mount Tabor, on the top of which stood a fortress. There, too, were the ruins of a church and the 452 monasteries which the Mohammedans had destroyed. The Crusaders climbed the hill in the face of the enemy's arrows and stones, and would have carried the fortress easily by assault, but for one of those panics which were always seizing the Christians at this period. They all turned and fled down the slope of the hill in the wildest confusion. On their return to camp the chiefs accused each other. The soldiers talked of treachery, and the patriarch refused any more to bring out the wood of the cross, for this imposture had been started again. To revive the spirits of the army, Andrew ordered a march into Ph-Nisha. The time was winter, cold, hail and rain killed the troops. On Christmas Eve a furious tempest destroyed their camp and killed their horses. Dejected and discouraged, the Christians returned to Acre. Famine began again, and it was resolved to separate into 4 camps. John de Brienne, King of Jerusalem with the Duke of Austria, commanded the first, which lay in the plains of Caesarea. The kings of Hungary and Cyprus the second, which was stationed at Tripoli. The master of the Templars the third at the foot of Mount Carmel. The fourth remained at Acre. The king of Cyprus died, and the king of Hungary went home again. He had got possession of the head of St. Peter, the right hand of St. Thomas, and one of the 7 vessels in which the water had been turned into wine. His anxiety to put these treasures in a place of safety was the chief cause that led him to forsake the crusade. After his departure the Crusaders changed all their plans, and it is very curious to observe how persistently they avoided Jerusalem, the pretended object of their aims, embarked at Acre for the siege of Damietta, which they took after nearly 2 years of fighting. This taken, they advanced on Cairo. On the way, for we have no space to follow all their misfortunes, the Nile overflowed. They were cut off from all hope of succor, assailed on every side by the 453 enemy, and finally compelled to offer terms. During the negotiations they found themselves deprived of everything, encamped on a plain inundated by the waters of the Nile, worn out by hunger and sickness. The king of Jerusalem went himself to the Sultan. There he sat down and shed tears. "Sire," said the Sultan, "why do you weep?" "Sire," replied the king, "I do well to weep, for the people with whom God has charged me I see perishing in the midst of the waters and dying of hunger." The Sultan had pity on the king and wept himself, and for 4 days running sent 30,000 loaves daily to poor and rich. So ended a crusade which showed neither prudence nor bravery, which began with an artificially excited enthusiasm, and was carried on by the leaders in hopes of gaining personal distinction. There was no discipline, no strong bond of a common hope. The knights deserted the banners after a defeat and went home, some of them without even striking a blow, and even in this time of relic worship, the wood of the cross failed to animate the spirits of the soldiers. Of all the crusades, this was the least worthy of success, the least animated by religious ardor. We are next to see the conquest of Jerusalem absolutely effected by a crusader, but by a crusader under excommunication and interdict, by means of a treaty with the Mohammedans, and actually against the will and wishes of the Church. It is a troubled and tangled web of dissimulation, ambition, and interested motives, into which we dare not venture. 78 On the one hand we have a sovereign, clear-sighted, gifted with a strong will, highly educated, equal at all points of scholarship and attainments to any churchman, holding tolerant views as to differences of religion, a poet, a musician, and an artist. 454 1, 2, who loved to associate with poets and artists, who surrounded himself with Mohammedan friends, and made no sign of displeasure when they performed the devotions due to their religion in his very presence, a lawyer far in advance of his age, a gallant lover, and a magnificent prince. In his Sicilian court he welcomed alike Christian, Jew, and Mohammedan, even Saracen ladies. Here the sturdy and uncompromising faith of Western Europe was shorn of its strength, and sapped by the spirit of toleration, or even worse, by the spirit of free thinking. Frederick himself wrote and spoke Arabic. He corresponded with the Sultan of Damascus, receiving from him, and propounding himself, curious questions in geometry. Society, in fact, modern society born before its time, was about to grow up amid the fostering influences of Frederick, when its growth was checked and destroyed by the interposition of the Pope. For on the other side stood the monk, cold, bigoted, cut off from social influences, old in the practice of austerities, fanatic in the cause of the Church, arrogating to himself the blind obedience of the whole world, claiming ever more and more the domination over men's hearts. The monk, personified by Pope Gregory Roman IX, formerly the Cardinal Ugolino, confronted the king and bade him do his bidding, while to his monastic eyes the existence of such a court as that of Frederick's was blasphemous, devilish, and full of sin. See Milman S. Hist. Of Latin Christianity, Vol. Roman 4, p. 196 et seq., for as clear a statement of the imbroglio between Frederick and the Pope as can well be looked for. Frederick had taken the cross. He had, moreover, pledged himself to embark for the Holy Land in August 1227. The time approached. Frederick had already opened up negotiations with el-Malik el-Kamil, the Sultan of Egypt. Presents had passed between them, even an elephant had been sent, and the Church shuddered at this big and visible proof of treachery on the part of Frederick. Pilgrims meantime assembled by thousands and from all parts. Frederick failed in having 455 provisions and ships for all the throng. The heats of summer came on with violence and fever broke out. But the fleet sailed with Frederick. 3 days afterwards his ship came back. He was ill and could not go. Old Pope Gregory saw his opportunity. He would use his power. Frederick was not ill but only pretending illness. He preached from the text, "It must needs be that offences come, but woe unto him through whom they come." He pronounced the sentence of excommunication. Frederick wrote, on hearing of this, in perfect good temper, calmly stating the fact of his illness. He took no notice of the excommunication, but after holding a diet of the barons of Apulia, he issued an appeal to Christendom, calling on all the sovereigns of Europe to shake off the intolerable yoke of the priests, and declaring his own innocence in the matter of the broken covenant. He called to witness the ill-treatment and ingratitude with which the Church had always repaid those who submitted, the malice and bitterness with which the Church had always persecuted those who refused to submit, and he pointed to the power and wealth of Rome as contrasted with the poverty of the early Church. In the long history of the world's revolt against the pretensions of the priesthood, which has never for a moment ceased since these pretensions first began to make themselves heard, no more remarkable document has ever been issued, save only the famous Theses of Luther. Frederick was rewarded by a second excommunication, and the Pope placed every town in which he might be under interdict. Then the people of Rome rose in insurrection, and the Pope fled. Frederick went to the Holy Land. If he wished to avoid fighting with his friends, the Saracens, he had certainly succeeded, because the Crusaders, 40,000 in number, on hearing of Frederick's return to Italy, all re-embarked and went home again. The king, notwithstanding 456 peremptory order from the Pope forbidding him to embark so long as he was under the ban of the Church, set sail with a small fleet of 20 galleys and 600 knights. He arrived at Acre. The Knights Templars and Hospitallers received him as their king. Frederick was now married to Yolante, the daughter of John of Brienne, from whom he took the crown of Jerusalem, on the ground that he only held it in right of his wife, whose rights were now descended to her daughter. The clergy refused to meet him, and there came messengers from the Pope, by whose command the Knights of the Orders withdrew their help. Frederick went his own way. He sent Balian, Prince of Tyre, as an ambassador to el-Malik el-Kamil, who sent him back with valuable presents, Saracenic robes, singers and dancing girls, and above all Frederick's old friend Fakhr ed-Din. Then the Templars wrote to the Sultan proposing the assassination of the emperor. Kamil quietly sent on the letter to his friend, who read it and said nothing. The negotiations between Frederick and Kamil went on in secrecy. They were so far advanced that the former found himself in a position to disclose to the barons the terms proposed. He sent for the grand masters of the two orders and submitted his proposals to them. They refused to act without the Patriarch. Frederick, knowing well enough that the Patriarch would refuse to act without the Pope's consent, replied that he could do without that prelate. And then the treaty was signed. The Christians were to have Jerusalem, except the Mosque of Omar, where the Mohammedans were to worship freely. The Saracens were to have their own tribunal. The Emperor, King of Jerusalem, was to send no succor to any who might attack the Sultan, with some minor points, and as soon as the treaty was signed, the Germans set off with Frederick and the master of the Teutonic Knights to the Holy City. The Christians had got back their city. The Church of Christ refused 457 to have it, or to acknowledge in any way the treaty. Frederick rode into the city to find the church empty and deserted. With his knights and soldiers he marched up the aisle, took the crown from the altar, and put it on his own head without oath or religious ceremony of any kind. Nor did he affect any religious zeal or manifest any emotion. "I promised I would come," he said, "and I am here." It was his answer to the world, and his defiance of the Pope. His vow was fulfilled in a literal sense, but the crusade was ruined. He had done more than any other king since Godfrey. He had recovered the city, but without slaughtering the infidel, and subject to the conditions that the Mohammedans were to practice, their religion within its walls. What did Frederick care for a religion which he confounded with the gloomy teaching of his ecclesiastical enemies? "I am not here," he confided to his friend Fakhr ed-Din, "to deliver the holy city, but to maintain my own credit." And 2 days after his coronation he went away again, in cynical contempt of the city and its church. He wrote a letter to the Pope and sovereigns of Europe, stating that he had, by miracle, taken the city which was henceforth Christian. The Pope, in an agony of rage at the way in which his enemy had ignored his excommunication, foamed at the mouth and called the treaty a treaty of Belial. Moreover, he could not but feel the awful irony of the situation, when Jerusalem itself and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre were forbidden to have the service of the Christian religion performed in them, because their deliverer, a Christian king, was under the interdict of the Pope. And here, reluctantly, we must leave the fortunes of Frederick, not perhaps a good man, but a better man than the arrogant and implacable monk who opposed him, and perhaps, from an unecclesiastical point of view, the best man in a high place at that time in all the world. The treaty was signed in 1229. Frederick, in leaving 458 Palestine, left the Christians without a chief, without a head. The Christians in Jerusalem, always dreading an attack from the Saracens, were constantly taking refuge in the Tower of David or the surrounding deserts. The Patriarch, who had done most to estrange the Emperor, wrote letter after letter, imploring for help. How many such letters had been sent since the Crusades had first commenced? Gregory had concluded some sort of reconciliation with Frederick, and now asked his help in an attempt to get up a new crusade. It was left to the Franciscan friars. Saint Francis of Assisi had himself been present at the crusade of King Andrew to preach this. 1237, there were found a large number of barons in France to enroll their names, and by the Council of Tours it was resolved that the cross should no longer be a pretext for the safety of every sort of criminal. But while the Crusaders were assembling, came the news of the downfall of the Latin kingdom of Constantinople, and a discussion begun as to whether it were better to go to the help of that city instead of Jerusalem, and before they had decided, came a message from Frederick urging them to wait for him. While they waited, civil war broke out in Italy. The old animosity between Frederick and the Pope was revived. And worse than this, the treaty which Frederick had made with el-Malik el-Kamil, which was for 10 years only, expired, and the Saracens from Kerak, marching suddenly upon Jerusalem, took it without the least resistance and razed the Tower of David. The Pope had forbidden the Crusaders to leave Europe, but in spite of his prohibition, a small army under the Duke of Brittany and the Count of Champagne landed in Acre. After a few ineffective forays, they experienced a defeat which cost them the loss of many of their leaders. So they all went home again, and were replaced by an English prince, Richard of Cornwall, who afterwards called himself Emperor of Germany. The Saracens thought that 459 Richard Lionheart was coming back again, and awaited his approach with the keenest terror. But he did nothing. Abandoned both by Templars and Hospitallers, he contented himself with ransoming the Christian prisoners, and after visiting Jerusalem and worshipping at the holy places, Richard returned to Europe and the turmoil of European wars. And now a new enemy appeared in the field. The people of Khazarm, driven westwards by the Tartars, came into Syria, a wild and ferocious band, with their wives and children, sparing neither Mohammedans nor Christians. Had the forces in Syria been united, a successful stand might have been made against them, but the Mohammedans were divided amongst themselves, and the Sultan of Cairo offered the Khwarezmians Palestine for their own if they would conquer it. They accepted the offer with joy and marched 20,000 strong upon Jerusalem. All the people in the city abandoned it hastily, except the helpless, poor and infirm. These the Khwarezmians found in their beds, and after killing them, thirsting for more blood, they inveigled back the Christians by hoisting the flags of the cross. The flying Christians, looking round from time to time, caught sight at last of the banner of victory. Satisfied that God had delivered the city by a special miracle, and hearing, moreover, the bell ring for prayer, they trooped back to the city. Directly they were within the gates, the Khwarezmians, who had only withdrawn a short distance, returned and surrounded them. In the depth of night the unhappy Christians endeavoured to fly. They were all cut to pieces, none were spared, and the barbarians then turned their wrath upon the very tombs, and tore up the coffins of Godfrey and Baldwin, which they burned with all the sacred relics they could find. The Templars at Acre called on the Saracen princes of Damascus, Emesa and Kerak, to make common cause 460 against their common enemy. They came to Acre, headed by the valiant El-Melik El-Menshur, prince of Emesa, whose entrance into the city was greeted with shouts of applause. The allied armies met the Khwarezmians on the plain of Philistia, the battlefield of so many periods and so many peoples. A curious incident is told, which took place before the battle. The Count of Jaffa, an excommunicated man, asked the Patriarch, who was there with his wood of the cross as usual, for absolution. He refused it. Again he asked to be again refused. But then the Bishop of Bama, impatient of his superior's obstinacy, cried out, "Never mind. The Patriarch is wrong, and I absolve you myself." Of course one priest's absolution is as good as another's, and the Count went into battle to be killed with a light heart. They fought all that day, and all the next day with a ferocity which nothing could equal. But then the Mohammedans gave way, and the victory remained with the Khwarezmians. Of the allies 30,000 lay dead on the field, while of the Christian knights, there returned to Acre only the Prince of Tyre, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, with his wood, 33 Templars, 26 Knights of St. John, and 3 Teutonic Knights. The Khwarezmians came before Jaffa. They tied Walter de Brienne, who was their prisoner, to a cross, and told him that unless he exhorted the besieged to submission they would put him to death. He called on the garrison to defend themselves to the last extremity, and was sent to Cairo, where he was murdered by the mob. Palestine was relieved of the presence of the Khwarezmians by the Sultan of Cairo, who sent them to Damascus, which they took and plundered. They then demanded the fulfillment of his promise as regarded the lands of Palestine. But the Sultan prevaricated and refused, sending an army of Egyptians against them. They were defeated in 10 battles and perish out of history altogether, having only appeared for the brief space of 3 or 4 years. 461, the Khwarezmians were gone, but the Christians, who had suffered most of any at their hands, were in a condition of terrible weakness. So threatening was the state of affairs that they once more forced their claims on the Pope, and showed how, without help, they were all undone. The Pope renewed all the privileges accorded by his predecessor to those who took the cross, and then followed the Crusades of St. Louis. Of his expedition to Egypt, the siege of Damietta, the calamities which befell his army, his own captivity, his ransom and freedom, we cannot here speak. They belong to the special history of the Crusades. It was in 1250, after his return, that St. Louis visited Acre. He had with him a small number of knights, all in rags and deprived of everything. A pestilence broke out in the city. Louis remained, endeavouring to ransom the 12,000 Christian captives from the Sultan of Cairo. Meantime he was urgently wanted at home, where that most singular movement known as the Revolt of the Pastoraux was distracting his country, and all efforts failed to raise bands of new crusaders. Some, however, went to join the king. Among them was a Norwegian knight, named Eleanor de Sellingen, according to Joinville, who with his companions beguiled the time till they should be fighting the Saracens by slaying the lions in the desert. The Sheik of the Assassins also sent an embassy with presents to Louis, asking for his friendship, and offering to remain as firmly allied to him as the fingers on the hand or the shirt to the body. Ives, a monk who could speak Arabic, was sent back on the part of the king with a present of gold and silver cups and scarlet mantles. He brought back a confused and wondrous story of the religion of this sect, CP 322. He described them oddly as having a wonderful veneration for Peter, whom they maintained to be still alive, and he told how a mournful silence reigned round the castle of the sheik, and how, when he appeared in public, a 462 herald went before, crying out, "Whoever you are, fear to appear before him who holds in his hand the life and death of kings." Louis, meantime, was repairing the fortifications of Caesarea and Jaffa, and making severe laws against the dissolute morals of the Christians in the East and of his own men. His knights went on pilgrimages to Jerusalem, whither he refused himself to go. But he went to Nazareth, to Mount Tabor, and other sacred places. After a little fighting, the news of his mother's death determined him to go home. He sailed in 1254, having been 4 years engaged in his disastrous expedition, which only had the effect of making the Mohammedans cautious how far they attacked the Christian settlements, and mindful of the exasperation into which their fall might throw the west of Europe. The subsequent efforts to raise a crusade all failed. The poets as well as the priests did their best, but with no success. It is remarkable, however, that there is not a word about crusading in the whole of the Romance of the Rose, except a reference or two to the Palm of the Pilgrim. Neither of its writers, certainly, was at all likely to be touched by the crusading enthusiasm. Routebeuf, however, throws himself into the projected crusade with extraordinary vigour. "Ha, Roi de France!" he cries. "Ha, Roi de France! Acre est tout jour en balance." He laments that no one will come to the help of the sacred places. "Ah, Antioch, ah, holy land! Thy piteous wail has reached this strand. We have no Godfrey, brave and bold. The fire of charity is cold in every Christian heart. And Jacobin and Cordelier may preach, but not for love or fear. Will soldier now depart?" He shows, too, the change come over the thoughts of 463 men by giving a dispute between a Croix and one who refuses to take the cross, in which the latter advances the startling proposition, not heard since the time of Origen, that a man can very well get to heaven without pilgrimizing, and without fighting for the cross. 79. G disque sil est funax. Qui si mest en autrui servage. Quant dispute gainer sakes. Et vivre de son heritage. But Routebeuf is very urgent. He laments the decay of religious zeal. "O'ergrown with grass the long road lies, thick trodden once by eager feet, when men pressed on with streaming eyes, themselves to offer at God's seat. They send instead wax tapers now. God has no true hearts left below." The fatal thing, however, was a feeling slowly growing up that it was God's will that the Church of the Sepulchre should belong to the infidel, and a bishop of a somewhat later time gives 3 reasons for this, namely, first, as a plea for the Christians, second, for the confusion of the Saracens, and thirdly, for the conversion of the Jews. And for the first reason, he argues that Christians will never be allowed to have the city again till they are sinless, because God will not have his children commit sin in such a place. As for the Saracens, they are, of course, only dogs. Now the master of a house is not very careful about the behavior of his dogs, but he cannot bear ill behavior on the part of his children. Little now remains to tell, because Jerusalem passes away from history, and the events which follow are hardly even indirectly concerned with the Holy City. Louis led another crusade and met his death at Tunis. Edward of England, with his brother Edmund and 800 men, came to Acre, but were, of course, of little use with so small a reinforcement, and after concluding a treaty with 460 for the Sultan of Egypt, they too departed. Then 20 years of expectation and fear pass away. Europe looks with indifference upon the Holy Land. Laodicea is taken, Tripoli is taken, and lastly Acre itself is taken. The siege of this, the last place held by the Christians, lasted a month. When the Mohammedans entered the city after a furious assault, they were driven back by arrows and stones hurled from the houses. Day after day they came on, were repelled with slaughter, and every day the Christians saw their camp growing larger and larger. The military orders fought with a heroism which caused the Saracens to think that 2 men were fighting in every night, but the end came at length with a great and terrible carnage. The nuns, trembling and yet heroic, actually preserved their honor by cutting off their noses so that the Saracens only killed them. The Patriarch of Jerusalem was put on board a ship, entreating to be allowed to die with his flock. The ship sank and he was drowned so that his prayer was granted. A violent storm was raging. Ladies rushed to the port, offering the sailors all they had, diamonds, pearls, and gold, to be put on board. Those who had no money or jewels were left on the shore to the mercies of the victors. The Templars held out in their castle a few days longer and then fell. All were killed. So ended, after 200 years of continued fighting, the Christian settlements in Palestine. AD the West heard the news of the fall of Acre with a sort of unreasoning rage, and instantly set about mutual accusations as to the cause of its fall. And the wretched Polani, the Syrian Christians, who had survived the taking of Acre, dropped over one by one to Italy and begged their bread in the streets while they told the story of their fall. In the same year, the house of the Virgin was miraculously transferred from Nazareth to a hill in Dalmatia, whence by another miracle it came to Loreto. Why did not the Holy Sepulchre come too? 465 pilgrims and travellers continued to visit Jerusalem. Sir John Mandeville was there, early in the 14th century, and describes the churches and sacred sites, but says little enough about the condition of the people. Bertrand de la Roquière was there 100 years later. He says that though there were many other Christians in Jerusalem, the Franks experienced the greatest amount of persecution from the Saracens, and that there were only 2 Cordeliers in the Church of the Sepulchre. And in the same century Ignatius Loyola twice went on pilgrimage. He wished to end his days in Palestine, but this was unhappily denied him, and he returned to be a curse to the world by establishing his society. Among other pilgrims, passing over various princes and kings, may be mentioned Court, the bookseller of Altona early in the 18th century, who was the first to assail the authenticity of the sites, and that of Henry Mondrel, chaplain to the English factory at Aleppo. But during the interval of 500 years, Jerusalem has been without a history. Nothing has happened but an occasional act of brutality on the part of her masters towards the Christians, or an occasional squabble among the ecclesiastics. Perhaps sometime the day may come when altogether will be agreed that there is no one spot in the world more holy than another, in spite of associations, because the whole earth is the Lord's. Then the tender interest which those who read the Scriptures will always have for the places which the writers knew so well may have a fuller and freer play, apart from lying traditions, monkish legends and superstitious impostures. For, to use the words which Cicero applied to Athens, there is not one spot in all this city, no single place where the foot may tread, which does not possess its history. Chapter 19. The Modern City and its Inhabitants. Jerusalem stands upon a tongue of land, bounded on the west by the valley of Hinnom, and on the east by the valley of Jehoshaphat, 2 deep wadis, which, uniting at the southern extremity under the name of the Kedron, flow down together to the Dead Sea. The promontory thus formed is divided again by a smaller valley, called the Tyropon, bisecting the city from north to south, and running from the Damascus Gate by the pool of Siloam into the Kedron. 2 hills or spurs thus project from the elevated ground on the northwest of the city, of which the western, the higher of the 2, is called Mount Sion and the eastern Mount Moriah. Upon the last stood the Temple of the Jews, and upon it at the present day stands the far-famed Masjid el-Aqsa, better known as the Haram-es-Sharif, or Noble Sanctuary. Between the valley of Hinnom and that of the Tyropon, a narrow neck of ground is occupied by the citadel or Tower of David. In shape the city is an irregular rhomboid, the longest diagonal of which measures something less than a mile. It covers about 209 acres of ground, of which 35 are occupied by the area of the Haram-es 467 Sharif. There are 5 gates: the Damascus Gate in the center of the north side, St. Stephen's Gate on the east, a little to the north of the Haram, the Water or Dung Gate in the Tyropon Valley, with the Sion Gate on the south side, and the Jaffa Gate immediately under the walls of the city on the west. The main street is about 3/5 of a mile long, and bisects the city from north to south. From this the other streets run, for the most part, at right angles, that which follows the direction of the north wall of the Haram being called the Via Dolorosa, and containing the Roman archway known as the Ex Homo Arch. The city is divided into quarters, defined by the intersection of the principal street, and that which crosses it at right angles from the Jaffa Gate to the Bab-es-Silsileh, one of the gates of the Haram. They are named after the different sects to whom they are appropriated. 81 The Mohammedan quarter comprises the northeast portion of the town, also of course including the Haram area. The Christian quarter is in the northwest. The Jewish quarter consists of all the southeastern part, except so much of it as it covered by the Haram, and the remaining quarter, the hill of Sion on the southwest, is appropriated to the Armenians. The mountains which encompass Jerusalem are dull and unvaried in outline, and being composed of white limestone, there is an utter absence of all pleasing variety of colouring. Nor does the intense clearness of the atmosphere add much to the general effect, diminishing as it does the distance, and dwarfing the proportions of all around. The view from the Mount of Olives, situated immediately to the east of the city, alone forms an exception to the monotony of the general appearance of the neighbourhood, and from this really fine views are obtained. Looking on the city itself, the eye rests upon the graceful form and rich colouring of the Dome of the Rock, standing in its 468 picturesque and quiet enclosure, while the gilded dome of the Holy Sepulchre, the tapering minarets of numerous mosques, the massive walls and clustering buildings, combine to make a beautiful and even impressive picture. Turning to look eastward, a scene no less grand and novel presents itself. Before you, a little to the right, the mountains of Moab rise up high above the azure waters of the Dead Sea. The broad, deep valley of the Jordan comes in from the left, the course of the stream just discernible by the thin fringe of verdure which lines its banks, while the blank, dreary desert stretches almost to your very feet, making even the desolate hills of Jerusalem look green and fertile by the contrast. For these particulars, see the Ordnance Survey of Jerusalem, 1864-5. There are many objects of interest outside the city walls, and a walk round the town on the outside furnishes food for much curious antiquarian speculation. Commencing with the head of the valley on the northwest side, you pass the upper and lower pools of Gihon, the former situated in the midst of a picturesque Mohammedan cemetery. Turning down into the valley of Hinnom, and past the countless tombs excavated in the solid rock, you come to the well of Joab, the enrogel of Scripture, immediately opposite the queer little village of Siloam, which consists of caves faced with rude masonry or plaster. In the valley of Jehoshaphat, besides the modern Hebrew graves which lie so thickly together that they appear almost to form one broad pavement, there are several curious monuments. The tomb of Jehoshaphat, of which nothing but a pediment rising a little out of the ground and roughly bricked up is now visible. The tomb of Zechariah and the pillar of Absalom, two monolithic monuments of uncertain date, and a little cave chamber cut in the face of the rock, ornamented with two Doric columns and leading into a sepulchral vault, which is said to have formed the hiding place of St. James the Apostle 469 during the first Christian persecution. Then come the Fountain of the Virgin, the Garden of Gethsemane, and the site of the Ascension upon the Mount of Olives. All these, with many others, and the traditions which attach to each, have been too well and too frequently described by travellers to need that we should dwell upon them here. The cenaculum, or Tomb of David, is situated at the southwest angle of the town, outside the city walls. The history of this has been already related on p. 436. The olive groves by which the city is surrounded, and of which such glowing descriptions have been given by enthusiastic pilgrims, are scanty and, like most other olive groves, exceedingly ugly and uninteresting. To tell the sober truth, it is impossible to grow very rapturous over a stunted tree, with greasy, silver-grey foliage and dilapidated trunk. On a gala day, however, when a motley throng, dressed in bright colours and fantastic garb, crowd outside the Jaffa Gate, disperse themselves amongst the tombs in the cemetery of the upper pool of Gihon, or cluster in animated groups beneath the olive trees, the scene is one which a lover of the picturesque might travel far to see. The city is completely walled round, presenting the appearance of a huge fortress. By the Jaffa Gate, where the Tower of Hippicus rises above the walls, and the cypresses of the Armenian convent gardens peep over the battlements, they are pretty and picturesque, but with this exception, there is nothing whatever in them to arrest the attention. Examining them more closely, you are struck with the great size of the stones used in their construction, many of which, especially in the lower portions, are doubtless of great antiquity. Captain Warren, in the course of his excavations at the southeast angle and elsewhere, has come upon blocks which may still occupy the place where Solomon's workmen laid them, but now 470 that the excavations are discontinued, and the shafts closed, the pilgrim will be grievously disappointed if he expect to find a single stone in situ. Houses are all built of roughly hewn blocks of stone. Syrian houses have flat roofs, but the want of timber for beams renders this construction impossible in the southern part of Palestine, and the deficiency is supplied by furnishing the buildings with large stone domes. From the nature of the ground, there is not a single level street in Jerusalem. The streets are paved with the hard limestone of the country, worn smooth with constant traffic, and this makes them cleaner than those of many other eastern towns. Nothing could be more out of harmony with all sacred associations than the interior appearance of modern Jerusalem. True, there is something picturesque and romantic about the narrow streets, the quaint old archways, and the ruins upon which you stumble at every turn. But the ruins are those of Saladin's city, not of Herod's, while the Jerusalem of David and of Solomon lies crushed and buried 20 fathoms underground. Of course, the two principal objects of attraction in Jerusalem are the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Haram-es-Sharif. The actual sepulchre is covered by a small chapel coated with reddish marble, and is surrounded by a circular building of fine proportions, with a magnificent dome. The Greek church is immediately to the east of this rotunda, and Calvary to the southeast, and some 12 or 13 feet above it. The only entrance is by a door leading into an open court on the south, and this is never opened except by the Mohammedan official who has charge of it, and with the permission of the patriarch of one of the Christian sects. On a bench inside the door sits a Turkish guard, whose duty it is to see that the Christians do not cut each other's 471 throats in order to show their zeal for the faith, and the precaution is far from needless. The open court in front of the entrance to the church is filled with native Christian peddlers from Bethlehem, who drive a thriving trade in crosses, rosaries, incense, and other devotional wares. Of the various traditional sites within the church, and of the respective authenticity of each, it is not our province here to speak. Suffice it to say, the priests have crowded into this small area every incident of the Passion and Crucifixion of our Lord, as well as a great many others of which the ordinary Christian has never heard. It is refreshing to escape from the narrow streets and noisy stifling bazaars into the quiet shady close of the Haram-es Sharif. The engraving prefixed to this volume conveys a good idea of the general effect of the buildings and the enclosure in which they stand. But in order completely to realize the scene, one must have the bright colors and the atmospheric effect, and above all, the dim religious light streaming in through the gorgeous stained glass windows of the Kubbat-es Sakra and the Mosque of El-Aqsa. A few years ago the traveler was debarred from this enjoyment, and could not even venture near the sacred spot without danger to life and limb from the infuriated fanatics who guard it. Now, however, a douceur to the sheikh, and the company of an attendant from the consulate or police station will be sufficient to procure the privilege. It is time that the jealous barbarity and insolent license of the Turks should be modified by the good sense of civilized nations, and that sanctuaries such as these, which are common to Christian and Mohammedan, should be thrown open to both. Perhaps some day Europe may learn that it is scarcely worthwhile to make war upon a Christian power for the sake of upholding a rotten and corrupt government, which repays the obligation by 472, encouraging its own subjects to insult and murder the subjects of its allies. The inhabitants of Jerusalem number about 16,000, and the pilgrims and travelers who annually visit it at Easter time are reckoned at about 15,000 more. The population is composed of such varied and discordant elements that to give an account of the different sects alone would occupy a volume. We do not profess to enter at all into the question from a theological point of view, but simply to give a brief account of the various peoples inhabiting Jerusalem as they appear to the traveler of the present day. First in order come the Mohammedans, Turkish and native, who, although they give themselves the airs for which the true believer is distinguished, and look with ill-concealed aversion and contempt upon all besides themselves, yet are not perhaps quite so fanatical as those in other towns of the Holy Land. They are, for the most part, Orientals of the conventional type, leading lazy, useless lives, and dividing their time between smoking, praying, bargaining, and cursing. The Turks have the same stupid pasty look which all town-bred Turks have. The natives are remarkable for nothing but sturdy limbs, an inordinate appetite for brown bread and onions, and an incessant habit of reckoning up real or imaginary gains. If you see two fellahin coming along the road, you may venture anything that their conversation will be of piasters, and that the first word you hear will be a numeral. We must do the Mohammedans the justice to say that the bigotry is not all on their side, for a Jew's life is not safe if he so much as venture into the neighborhood of the Holy Sepulchre. The Christians are of so many different types and nations that it is almost hopeless to attempt to enumerate them all. The following are, however, the chief divisions. 473. The native Christians are chiefly from Bethlehem. They are a fine athletic race, much fairer than the Muslim peasantry, and exhibiting unmistakable traces of an admixture of European blood, dating back, no doubt, from the crusading times. The women are sometimes exceedingly pretty, and their costume very picturesque. They wear a loose-fitting, coloured dress and a saucepan-shaped cap upon their head, over which is thrown a white mantle or veil reaching almost to the feet. The men wear enormous turbans and the ordinary striped abba or cloak of coarse goat's hair. This, with a linen shirt, leather belt, and enormous yellow slippers, completes their dress. They do a large trade in rosaries, crosses, carved shells, beads, and olive wood fancy articles, and are a quiet and industrious people. The Syrians, or Jacobites, are a small body who occupy a monastery upon Mount Sion, called the House of St. Mark. The present bishop is an intelligent man, a native of Asia Minor. 1 or 2 monks of the monastery, and the old woman who cleans up the place, are natives of a village near Ain Tab, on the banks of the Euphrates, the only spot where the Syriac language is spoken. In this little convent the traveller may still hear the accents of that ancient tongue, and probably, as the old lady is no lover of monkish indolence, He will have the opportunity of judging of its capabilities as a scolding medium. The Greek community consists mainly of monks, with a slight sprinkling of dragomen and wineshop keepers. The Greek monk, with his handsome face, reverend beard, and severely simple costume, is a noble and saintly figure as to the outward man. But Greek monks, known more intimately, are found to be a drunken and sensual crew, devoid alike of honor and religion. We speak of the monks only, for the Patriarch of Jerusalem and one or two of his bishops are gentlemanly and even learned men, while amongst the laymen attached to the educational branch of 474, the convent may be made some agreeable acquaintances. Although the blasphemous fraud of the descent of the Holy Fire on Easter Sunday is countenanced by the Armenians, it is really kept up by the Greeks, and performed by the Greek Patriarch. A more degrading spectacle than this can scarcely be imagined. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre crammed to suffocation with eager, half-mad pilgrims, and the chief dignitary of the Orthodox Church of Christ, solemnly entering into his tomb to juggle with a box of lucifer matches. What wonder that the infidel soldiers, who keep the peace in the church, gaze on the scene with a supercilious and derisive smile. About Easter time, the city begins to swarm with Russian pilgrims. These are, perhaps, the only real religious enthusiasts among the crowds who annually come to worship at the Holy City, and no one who has seen the reverence with which they look upon everything in the place, even to the drunken monk who admits them into the church, or the genuine emotion, and awe which they display when kneeling before the sight of some absurd tradition, can doubt for one moment of their sincerity. Many a weary mile must they tramp along in their native land, many an unheard of hardship must they encounter before they can toil up the sides of Mount Sinai or reach the foot of Calvary. And yet they never seem to grow sick or faint-hearted, but plod on with a marvelous steadiness of purpose, and whenever you meet a Russian pilgrim, whether it be in the midst of the scorching desert or by the shady banks of Jordan, he will greet you, respectful salutation and a bright contented face. At Jerusalem itself they may well be content, for the Russian government has built a hospice near the Jaffa Gate where thousands of these poor pilgrims are taken in and cared for. This immense establishment is furnished with dormitories, refectories, chapel, reading rooms, hospitals, and c. 475, and for cleanliness and good management would compare favorably with any institution of the kind in Europe. The Copts have a large monastery of their own immediately contiguous to the Holy Sepulchre, and have contrived, by bribing a Turkish official, to appropriate a great portion of the funds and buildings belonging to the Abyssinians too. At the back of the chapel of the Holy Sepulchre under the dome is a little oratory belonging to this sect. The Copts of Jerusalem are little better than transplanted Egyptian fellahin. Their large round features and heavy looks easily distinguish them from the rest of the population. The Abyssinians are an exceedingly gentle and inoffensive community. They are principally employed as domestic servants by the European residents in the city. They have a monastery, or rather, a few cells amidst the ruins of what was once a monastery, in an open court over the chapel of Helena, part of the buildings of the Holy Sepulchre. Here a few monks and a few nuns live in the utmost squalor and misery, subsisting on charity, and in a chronic state of fever. They exhibit great kindness and affection for their compatriots, and are always ready to assist from their own scanty means any Abyssinian who may come to them in distress. They are perhaps the only monks to whom can be conscientiously applied the name of men. The Armenians are a thriving and industrious people, and their quarter is the only one in Jerusalem in which any regard is evinced for cleanliness or order. The large convent of St. James, the son of Zebedee, on Mount Sion, belongs to them, and the street immediately outside its gates might almost be mistaken for that of some European continental town. The church is the most richly decorated of any in the city, and amongst other curiosities, possesses the chair traditionally supposed to have belonged to St. James. The Patriarch is a gentleman and an accomplished 476 man of the world, and even amongst the monks may be found some who devote themselves to photography and other useful arts. The Armenian is easily distinguishable by a florid complexion, very prominent nose, and dark hair. The Georgians are a small and insignificant body, occupying the convent of the Holy Cross outside Jerusalem, to the left of the Jaffa Road. Of the Occidental Christian communities need only be mentioned the Latins. Amongst a number of monks of the conventional low Romish type, there are few intellectual men who devote themselves to educating the poor peasantry of the neighborhood. Their convents are more orderly, have more of life in them, than those of the Oriental Christians, and one is bound to say that the Latin clergy in Jerusalem do make the best of that parent of all social evils, the celibacy of the priesthood. The Jews of Jerusalem are almost entirely supported by their coreligionists in Europe, upon whose charity they impose, and whose name they disgrace. They are divided into two classes: the Ashkenazim, who consist chiefly of emigrants from Germany and Poland, and the Sephardim, who claim connection with the old Hebrew families of Spain. The Sephardim are far superior to the others, both in culture and in manners, and have occasionally a certain air of oriental dignity about them. The Ashkenazim, on the contrary, are, for the most part, mean and disreputable in appearance, and apparently belong to the lowest orders of society. With his dull, exaggerated German Jewish features, his ridiculous garb, a long Eastern kaftan or vest, and a broad-brimmed slouch hat, from which depend on either side of the face the Pharisaic lovelocks, the Ashkenaz Jew of Palestine resembles nothing so much as his representative in modern theatrical burlesque. The services in their synagogue are conducted in a shamefully careless and indifferent manner, and the 477 weekly ceremony of wailing over the stones of the temple, when not regarded through that distorting medium of religious enthusiasm which too many travelers bring with them to the Holy Land, is simply a farce. This picture is a melancholy one. Much as one may wish that it could have been painted in brighter colors, it is best to present truthfully the impression which the modern city makes upon most travelers whose eyes are not blinded by the associations clinging to its soil. Filled with abuses, its sacred shrines defiled, and their worshippers exposed to constant danger and insult, Jerusalem is indeed trodden down of the Gentiles, until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled.